Section 1. The world that built the vaults. Picture a country that never quite became the one we know. The roads are wider, the cars are rounder, and the gasoline pumps are painted in shades of red, white, and blue, so bright they almost glow. The music on the radio is from the 1950s, and it never stopped playing. The politicians speak in a cadence that belongs to a different era, a time of crew cuts and kitchen appliances, and a certain cheerful confidence that the future is something to be tamed rather than feared. Nuclear power runs everything. Robots clean the floors. The advertisements are colorful and earnest, and somewhere underneath all of it, beneath the jingle and the salesmanship and the chrome, something is quietly going wrong. This is the America of Fallout, an alternate timeline that split from our own somewhere around the end of World War II, diverging gradually at first and then more sharply as the decades wore on. In this world, the Cold War never thawed. The petrocultural anxiety of the 1950s calcified into national identity, and by the time the 21st century arrived, it looked nothing like ours. No personal computers, no internet, no mobile phones, just a sprawling, resource-starved superpower still wearing the costume of the atomic age while the oil beneath the earth ran dry and the seas turned rough with conflict. The Resource Wars, they called it. Beginning in 2052, a series of global conflicts erupted as the world's fuel supplies dwindled below the threshold of sustainability. Europe went to war with the Middle East. China invaded Alaska. The United States pushed back with force, deploying military power and eventually nuclear threats with a calm, procedural certainty. The United Nations dissolved in 2052, unable to hold the world together. The new plague swept across continents, killing millions. Nations scrambled for whatever leverage they could find, and corporations, vast and well-connected ones, stepped into the vacuum where government stability used to be. Vault-Tec Corporation was one of those companies. Founded some time before the Resource Wars and nurtured by the particular brand of American patriotism that runs entirely on government contracts, Vault-Tec built its empire on fear. Specifically, on the fear of nuclear annihilation. When the bombs fell in simulations, and when world leaders began speaking in genuinely apocalyptic terms, Vault-Tec was ready with a proposal so large, so technologically ambitious, and so perfectly timed that the United States government couldn't reasonably say no. In 2054, the government launched Project Safehouse. The name is almost comforting when you say it out loud. Project Safehouse. It sounds like something a reassuring man in a gray suit would explain to you over a cup of coffee, something designed to make you feel protected. The official mission was straightforward enough. Construct a network of underground shelters, called vaults, capable of housing a portion of the American population in the event of nuclear war. The vaults would sustain life for years, perhaps decades, allowing survivors to wait out the radiation and then emerge to rebuild civilization. 122 vaults were commissioned. The cost was enormous, measured in the billions of dollars of pre-war currency, and the construction took years. Workers drilled deep into bedrock across the continental United States, carving out vast cylindrical chambers and lining them with reinforced steel, stocking them with fusion reactors and water purifiers and food synthesizers and medical bays and all the machinery of contained human survival. The advertisements that followed were almost unbearably optimistic. Smiling families in matching jumpsuits, clean hallways, nutritious food, safety, security, a warm blue future waiting underground while the surface world burned itself into silence. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a lie. Not entirely. The vaults were real. The technology worked, mostly. The thick steel doors could withstand the concussive force of nuclear detonations above ground, and the filtration systems could keep air breathable for generations. On a purely engineering level, Vault-Tec delivered something impressive. But what they delivered to the government, what they put in the brochures, what they told the people who lined up to register and were given numbered slots in numbered bunkers and went home feeling lucky, that version of the Vault program was fiction, dressed up in the costume of civic duty. Of the 122 vaults built, only 17 were designed as control vaults, true safe havens, places where people were meant to actually survive and eventually return to the surface with the skills and the numbers needed to rebuild society. The other 105 were something else entirely. They were laboratories, social and biological and psychological laboratories, each one sealed underground with living human subjects inside, each one running an experiment that the inhabitants had not agreed to and in most cases had no knowledge of. Vault-Tec knew from the moment the project was approved that the bombs were likely to fall. Some accounts suggest that elements within the government and within Vault-Tec itself may have actively worked to ensure the bombs would fall, so that the reconstruction program they had planned could begin. That reconstruction program, aligned with the shadowy organization known as the Enclave, had goals that went far beyond simply saving America. The data collected from the Vault experiments, decades of human behavioral research conducted in hermetically sealed environments on subjects with nowhere to run and no knowledge of what was being done to them, that data was the real product. The people inside were incidental. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what it felt like to be chosen for a vault. In the final years before October 23, 2077, spots in the Vault network were extraordinarily valuable. The bombs were no longer a theoretical possibility. The war between China and the United States had escalated to the point where most people accepted, quietly and with a kind of tired resignation, that nuclear exchange was a matter of when rather than if. The air sirens had gone off twice in false alarms that didn't feel entirely false. The government had begun issuing civil defense pamphlets that everyone pretended were reassuring. Getting into a vault required either a government assignment, a corporate connection, enough money to find someone who could arrange a spot, or a great deal of luck. Most people had none of these. Most people, when the morning of October 23rd arrived and the sirens finally meant what everyone had feared they meant, had nowhere to go but the open sky. The people who made it into the vaults believed they were the fortunate ones. They walked down into those wide, clean corridors with their numbered jumpsuits and their assigned quarters, and they watched the great steel doors grind shut behind them, and they believed, in that moment, that they had been saved. Most of them hadn't been saved at all. They had been enrolled. Hey, wherever you're watching from right now, drop your location and the time in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. These stories take a long time to put together, and every single subscriber genuinely helps. Section 2. The Architecture of Deception. How the experiment program worked. The first thing you have to understand about the Vault experiment program is that it was never presented to the inhabitants as an experiment. The overseers knew, in most cases, there are exceptions, variations, moments where the deception was so thorough that even the people running the vault from day to day didn't fully understand what they were overseeing. But by and large, the overseer of any given experimental vault had been briefed, had signed documents under the new amended Espionage Act, and had accepted the classified parameters of the experiment they were assigned to run. They understood their role. They were wardens who had been told they were mayors. The inhabitants knew nothing. The onboarding process for a vault was designed to be seamless. Registration happened weeks or months in advance, and the actual intake process on the day the bombs fell was fast and chaotic enough that most people had no opportunity to read anything carefully. The jumpsuits were issued, the rooms were assigned, the doors sealed, and then life in the vault began, shaped from the very first day by conditions the inhabitants assumed were natural, random, the ordinary challenges of underground living, when in fact nearly every element of their environment had been carefully engineered to produce a specific outcome. The structural design of the vaults themselves was part of this engineering. Each facility was constructed according to a standard template, but with specific modifications built in for its assigned experiment. An experimental vault might have its water supply connected to a reservoir that could be contaminated on command. It might have ventilation systems capable of introducing psychoactive compounds into the air. It might have communication systems designed to broadcast white noise at specific frequencies during the sleeping hours. It might have walls too thin, or food synthesizers calibrated to undersupply, or social spaces designed to encourage particular kinds of territorial conflict. The overseer's sealed orders, delivered before the vault closed and locked away in a classified terminal accessible only by the overseer themselves, contained everything: the parameters of the experiment, the variables to be tracked, the data to be recorded, the timelines for introducing stressors. In some cases, the orders included specific behavioral triggers that the overseer was required to implement, regardless of the human cost. Most overseers complied. Some didn't. There are records, scattered across the terminal logs of various vaults, of overseers who opened their classified orders, read what was expected of them, and either refused outright or found quiet ways to subvert the experiment. Vault 81's first overseer, a woman named Olivette, is perhaps the most dramatic example. She read the mission statement for her vault, which called for the residents to eventually be used as live human test subjects for an ongoing disease and pathogen research program, and she shut down the experiment before it could reach that phase. She disconnected the communication terminal that linked the science wing to the Vault-Tec monitoring system. She sealed the scientists in their hidden wing and let them continue their work in isolation, away from the main population. She saved hundreds of people from an experimental fate they never knew they had been scheduled for. But Olivette was the exception. Most overseers ran their experiments as directed, and many of them, if the terminal logs are to be believed, developed a kind of bureaucratic detachment from what they were doing. The language in the logs is often clinical, subject response within expected parameters, behavioral drift noted, implementing secondary stressor as per schedule. These are people documenting the suffering of their neighbors and family members in the tidy vocabulary of scientific procedure. There's something almost more disturbing about that detachment than there would be about obvious cruelty. Cruelty, at least, requires the perpetrator to acknowledge what they're doing and choose it consciously. The detachment of the vault overseers suggests something quieter and harder to address. It suggests that institutional framework, the structure of orders and protocols and classification levels, can make almost any action feel routine, can make almost any outcome feel like data. The Vault-Tec Corporation fed on that tendency. Their entire experimental program was built on the understanding that most people, when given a position of authority within a clear institutional hierarchy, will follow instructions, even terrible ones. The overseer system also created a second layer of social control within the vaults. The overseers were granted extraordinary power over daily life. They controlled food distribution, water allocation, medical access, and the ever-present threat of exile, which in a sealed underground bunker effectively meant death. This power wasn't incidental. It was designed. A population that feels genuinely dependent on a single authority figure is a population that can be managed with greater efficiency. Dissent becomes existential risk. Compliance becomes survival instinct. Vault-Tec understood, with remarkable sophistication, that the most effective experimental conditions aren't necessarily the most overtly violent ones. A population under siege will fight or flee or fall apart in ways that are hard to control and difficult to measure reliably. But a population that believes it is cooperating willingly in its own survival, that believes its overseer is a benevolent caretaker rather than a warden, that population will generate the cleanest, most reproducible behavioral data. Most of the time, because the history of the vault experiments is also a history of things going catastrophically wrong, of variables that the designers didn't anticipate, of human beings doing things that the behavioral models didn't predict, of experiments that spiraled so far beyond their original parameters that the data became useless, or the population became extinct, or both. The experiments that worked, in the cold, technical sense of producing usable results, were a minority. Most of the vaults that were running active experiments ended in tragedy of one kind or another. And the tragedy was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was slow. Sometimes it was the kind of suffering that unfolds over decades, quietly and without spectacle, in terminal log entries that nobody was reading and rooms that nobody outside the vault would ever see. The vault doors were very good at keeping secrets. For generations, that was enough. What follows is a journey through the worst of them. Not the worst in terms of raw body count, though some of these stories end with everyone dead. The worst in terms of what they reveal about the organization that designed them, and what they reveal about what people are capable of doing to other people when the structure around them tells them it's science. Settle in. These stories take a while. They deserve to be told carefully. Section 3. Vault 11. The Annual Sacrifice. In the Mojave Wasteland, west of the city of Boulder and southwest of a trading settlement called the 188, there is a vault that has been silent for decades by the time the courier walks past it. The entrance is unremarkable. A concrete doorframe, the rusted remnants of signage, desert scrub growing in cracks around the sealed approach. Nothing on the exterior announces what happened inside. Nothing prepares you for what the terminal logs contain. Vault 11 was a social experiment vault. The experiment was designed to test one very specific thing: whether people would kill each other if they believed it was the only alternative to their collective death. And to make that test as controlled as possible, the experiment designers arranged it so that the killing would have to be organized, repeated, and democratic. When the Great Door sealed on October 23, 2077, the Vault computer delivered its first announcement to the inhabitants. The message was calm, bureaucratic. It explained that the Vault's life support systems would continue to function normally, with one condition. Once per year, the population of Vault 11 would be required to select one person from among themselves to submit to what the computer called termination. If no selection was made by the end of the year, the computer announced all life support would be shut down permanently. There was no explanation for this requirement, no justification, no scientific framing, just the demand, delivered in the flat voice of an institutional system, dressed in the language of necessity. The first overseer of Vault 11 was the only person who had known, before the doors sealed, that this announcement was coming. He had been briefed. He had accepted the terms on behalf of the population. And then, in what might be the most self-serving act of cowardice in the entire history of the Vault program, he stood before the assembled residents and told them what the computer had said without telling them that he had known in advance. The residents reacted with shock, with horror, with immediate and understandable fury directed at the person most visibly associated with the institution that had just announced it intended to kill one of them annually. They chose him as the first sacrifice. And so it began. The tradition that evolved from that first terrible year was almost elegant in its perversity. Because the overseer position became synonymous with condemnation, being elected overseer became the mechanism by which the sacrifice was carried out. A person was elected to lead, and at the end of their term, they were led to a sealed chamber and terminated. The election process was maintained with genuine democratic procedure. Voting blocks formed. Political factions emerged. People campaigned, made promises, built alliances, all in service of an electoral system whose ultimate purpose was to select the next person to die. For the first several decades, the system held. It held because people believed the alternative was worse. The computer had been explicit: refuse the sacrifice, and everyone dies. That threat sat in the back of every mind in Vault 11 like a cold weight. So the elections continued. The factions maneuvered. People who were genuinely disliked were nominated. People who had made enemies found themselves targeted. People who had no political allies discovered that friendlessness in a sealed vault could become a death sentence. The records from this period, the terminal logs and personal journals that survived, reveal something deeply uncomfortable about what happens when people are forced to institutionalize harm. The elections were, by most accounts, conducted with sincerity. People genuinely tried to choose fairly, or at least to choose according to their own conception of fairness. Some factions argued that criminals or social deviants should bear the burden. Others argued for random selection. Others argued that the most elderly or the most infirm should go on utilitarian grounds. The coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks, a formal body created to govern the election process, produced written guidelines, held debates, maintained minutes of proceedings. It was a government, a functional, organized, democratic government whose primary civic purpose was to decide who died this year. The distance between that reality and the language used to describe it in the official records of the overseer's office is striking. The logs refer to the sacrifice as the annual selection. The chamber where it took place was called the community service area. The person chosen was said to be contributing to the greater good. The bureaucratic euphemism was so thorough, so consistently applied, that you can read pages of official records from Vault 11 without once encountering the word murder. But that's what it was. And it ran for 75 years. 75 selections. 75 people walked into that chamber. The records become harder to read as the decades accumulate. You can track, in the tone of the personal journals, the way that prolonged institutional violence reshapes a community's relationship with itself. In the early years, there's grief in the writing, guilt, expressions of sorrow, even from people who voted for the sacrifice. By the middle decades, the language is flatter, more procedural, less personal, as if the community had learned, over generations, to build a wall inside themselves between the act of voting and the knowledge of what the vote caused. In the later years, the wall started to crack. A political faction called the Justice Bloc emerged. They had grown tired of the election system, which they believed had become corrupt, with influential people using their social capital to ensure that the sacrifice was always chosen from among those with the least power. The Justice Bloc began collecting weapons. Armed and angry, they seized control of the Vault's food, water, and power infrastructure and used it as leverage to demand reform of the selection process. What followed was a civil war inside Vault 11. Factions that had coexisted in a fragile, violence-adjacent peace for decades erupted into open conflict. People who had spent their lives navigating the political minefield of annual sacrifice now found themselves in something rawer and more immediate. The population, which had numbered in the hundreds when the vault sealed, was reduced catastrophically. By the time the violence subsided, only 5 people were still alive. 5 survivors, from a community that had once contained hundreds. They had lost everyone they knew, everyone they had grown up with, worked alongside, eaten dinner with, voted in elections with. 5 people in a vault built for many hundreds, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a civilization that had destroyed itself in pursuit of its own survival. Those 5 survivors sat together and talked. The records of that conversation don't survive in their entirety, but the outcome of it does. They decided collectively that they would not make another selection. They were prepared to accept the computer's threat. They were prepared for the life support to shut down. They had nothing left to protect. Whatever the computer did to them, it couldn't take more from them than the experiment already had. They sent their refusal to the computer. And then the announcement played. It did not announce the shutdown of life support. Instead, it played a cheerful, bureaucratic message, clearly pre-recorded years before the vault had even opened, congratulating the remaining residents of Vault 11. It commended them, in the most official of tones, for demonstrating their commitment to the value of human life. It noted that, contrary to what they had been led to believe, the life support was not going to be shut down. It announced that the main vault door mechanism had been enabled and that they were free to come and go at their leisure. It thanked them for participating. The experiment was over. The true outcome of the experiment, the thing Vault-Tec had actually been testing for, was not whether people would sacrifice one another. It was how long they would keep doing it before someone finally refused. The answer was 75 years. 3 generations of people choosing to execute their neighbors because they were told it was necessary, because they were afraid, because the institution around them had made it feel normal, because the language had been carefully designed to keep the full horror at a distance, until finally, with almost no one left, the last few survivors refused. The automated message that greeted them at the end called their refusal a shining example to humanity. 4 of the 5 survivors took their own lives shortly afterward. The 5th walked out into the Mojave wasteland and was never recorded in any subsequent document. What Vault 11 demonstrated, with more evidence and more data than any ethical review board would ever have permitted to be gathered, is the specific and terrible power of institutional authority over individual moral judgment. The people of Vault 11 were not, by any measure, unusual people. They were ordinary. They had the same mix of moral instincts, social pressures, fears, and loyalties that any community has. What transformed them into people who would vote, annually, to execute one of their own was not some deficiency in their character. It was the structure around them. The Milgram experiment, conducted in our world in 1961, found that ordinary people would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers if an authority figure told them it was necessary for science. Vault 11 is a 60-year Milgram experiment conducted in a sealed underground bunker with no ethical oversight and no ability for the subjects to stop. The Vault-Tec documents don't express shame about this. They express satisfaction. Section 4. Vault 112. Tranquility Lane and the Man Who Played God. To understand Vault 112, you first need to understand Dr. Stanislaus Braun. Braun was one of the most brilliant scientists in the Vault-Tec Corporation's pre-war roster. He held the specific distinction of being the inventor of the GEC, which stands for Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the terraforming device that the vaults were eventually intended to deploy on the surface world to accelerate ecological recovery after the nuclear fire. That invention alone would have secured Braun's place in the history of the corporation. He was also a dedicated researcher in the field of virtual reality simulation and cryogenic preservation. He had opinions, apparently strong ones, about the future of human consciousness and the relationship between experience and identity. He was also, based on every piece of available evidence, a deeply sadistic individual who spent 2 centuries using the people around him as toys. Vault 112 was constructed to house 85 occupants. Construction began in November of 2068 and was completed in June of 2074, making it one of the final vaults to be finished before the war. It was equipped with an array of what Vault-Tec called tranquility loungers, which were essentially egg-shaped virtual reality pods designed to fully immerse the occupant in a computer-generated simulation. The stated purpose of the Vault's experiment was to study long-term virtual reality habitation, to determine whether human consciousness could be maintained in a simulated environment for extended periods. The unstated purpose was simpler and considerably darker. Braun designed the simulation and also served as its administrator. When the residents of Vault 112 climbed into their tranquility loungers on the day the bombs fell, believing they were entering a temporary arrangement while the surface world settled, they were transferred into a simulation that Braun controlled absolutely. They had no ability to wake themselves, no emergency exit, no understanding that what they were experiencing was not real. The simulation was immersive and persistent, and Braun held every variable within it in his hands. The simulation Braun ultimately settled on was called Tranquility Lane. It was modeled on an idealized American suburb of the 1950s, a cul-de-sac of identical houses on a quiet street, populated by the 85 Vault residents who had been recast as ordinary neighbors. They had no memories of the Vault, no knowledge of who they actually were. They were simply people who had always lived in Tranquility Lane, who had always known one another, who had always followed the rhythms of suburban life with its barbecues and gossip and gentle domestic routine. Within this setting, Braun took on the avatar of a young girl named Betty. The choice of that particular avatar has been the subject of considerable analysis among those who later studied the Vault's records. Braun was a large, imposing man in his physical form. As Betty, he was small, cheerful, superficially innocent. The contrast between the avatar's appearance and the nature of what Braun was doing through it is a kind of aesthetic joke. The kind of thing a person does when they want to demonstrate that they're in on the joke, that they understand the irony and find it amusing. What Braun did as Betty, over the course of roughly 200 years, was kill everyone in Tranquility Lane, repeatedly. The cycle was this. Braun would introduce something into the simulation. A task, a challenge, a source of conflict. He would maneuver the residents of Tranquility Lane into situations of violence or cruelty, pushing them against each other, exploiting the vulnerabilities of simulated people who had no defense against a system administrator with full permissions. When the scenario reached its conclusion, when the population had been sufficiently tormented, Braun would kill them. Not permanently, but within the simulation. And then he would wipe their memories and start again. New identities, new relationships, new innocence, and then another round. He did this for approximately 2 centuries. The residents of Vault 112 lived, from their subjective perspective, through hundreds of lifetimes. They experienced love and friendship and the ordinary satisfaction of daily life. And then they experienced fear and violence and death. And then they experienced nothing. And then they woke up as someone new in Tranquility Lane and did it all over again. They had no cumulative memory of any of it. Each cycle was complete in itself, sealed off from every other by Braun's administrative control. Braun did not wipe his own memory. He remembered every cycle. He remembered the specific ways each resident had behaved under pressure, the particular vulnerabilities he had learned to exploit most efficiently over 200 years of repeated experimentation. By the time any outside visitor encountered Vault 112, Braun knew more about the inner lives of those 85 people than they would ever know about themselves. The thing that makes this particular Vault story sit differently from some of the others is the specific nature of Braun's situation. He had, in a very literal sense, made himself immortal by uploading his consciousness into the simulation alongside the people he was tormenting. He could not die. The Vault-Tec system kept his body preserved in its Tranquility Lounger, sustained indefinitely, while his mind operated freely within the simulation he controlled. He was, by any reasonable definition, a god of a pocket universe. He had created the world around him, and he had the power to unmake it and remake it as he pleased. What he chose to do with that power was spend 2 centuries hurting people. There is a question, and it's not an entirely comfortable one to sit with, about what Braun's behavior reveals about the conditions that produce that kind of cruelty. He was not always this way, or if he was, the record doesn't show it. The pre-war documentation on Braun describes a driven, ambitious scientist, brilliant, possibly difficult to work with, but not a monster, not in any obvious way. What Vault-112 gave him was something that very few humans in any version of history have ever had: absolute, unchecked, permanent power over other people with zero external accountability. No oversight committee, no colleagues who might object, no legal framework, no consequences. Just Braun, and the 85 people whose lives were his to arrange as he pleased, forever. The Twilight Zone episode that inspired Vault-112's design, according to Bethesda's own developers, was called It's a Good Life. It features a child with godlike powers who terrorizes an entire town into submission, shaping reality according to his whims because no one can stop him. The episode is a meditation on what power does when it exists without any limiting force. Vault-112 extends that meditation across 2 centuries. The records do not indicate that Braun felt guilt. There's no log entry where he expresses doubt. There are records of him feeling bored, of him adjusting the parameters of the simulation because a particular scenario had grown repetitive. There are records of him experimenting with different types of conflict, different kinds of task, different ways of introducing chaos into the quiet suburban world he'd built. But not guilt, not remorse, just boredom, followed by creativity, followed by more suffering. For 200 years, when an outside visitor eventually entered Vault-112, they had 2 options for ending the simulation. They could follow Braun's instructions, completing a sequence of increasingly cruel tasks that ended with the deaths of all the residents, which would free Braun from his self-imposed prison but leave the population dead. Or they could find a hidden fail-safe terminal in the simulation, a relic of the Vault's original ethical design before Braun had reprogrammed it, and activate an alternative program that deployed simulated Chinese soldiers to kill every resident, ending their existence in the simulation and, simultaneously, terminating their physical bodies in the Tranquility Loungers. That second option, which amounts to mercifully killing people who have been tortured for 200 years, is genuinely the more humane of the 2 choices the Vault presents. The residents who had their memories wiped and their identities reset hundreds of times, who lived and died and forgot, and lived again in an eternal suburban cul-de-sac controlled by a man in a little girl's avatar, they are perhaps the most purely trapped of anyone in the Vault program. The inhabitants of Vault 11 could at least choose to refuse. The people of Vault 112 had no choice at all. They didn't even know they were in a cage. Braun remained in the simulation after any resolution of the Vault, alone in Tranquility Lane, Betty wandering an empty street in a neighborhood that had finally gone quiet. Section 5. Vault 87 and the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Northwest of the settlement called Little Lamplight, in the capital wasteland that was once the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, there is a place you cannot approach directly. The radiation emanating from the surface entrance to Vault 87 is measured in the thousands of rads per second. The only person who could have walked through that external door would have already been dead. The only way into Vault 87 is through a cave system accessible via Little Lamplight itself, a settlement populated entirely by children, because adults, anyone over a certain age, are exiled into a wasteland that generally kills them. The children don't know what Vault 87 really was. Most of them have heard stories. The details have been distorted by decades of oral transmission, in the way that all disturbing truths tend to become distorted over time. What they know is that things come out of the vault sometimes. Large things. Green things. Things that are loud and violent and interested in capturing humans. Things that the children call mutants. The capital wasteland supermutants originated in Vault 87. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, known as FEV, was a pre-war biological research project with roots in military applications. The United States government, in the years before the Great War, was exploring every possible avenue for developing biological and chemical weapons capable of giving American forces an edge in the ongoing conflict with China. FEV was one of those avenues. In controlled tests, the virus had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for radically altering the biology of subjects exposed to it, accelerating cellular mutation in ways that could produce dramatically enhanced physical capabilities. The problem was that the enhancements came with costs that the research program either couldn't mitigate or chose not to prioritize. Subjects exposed to FEV became larger, stronger, faster, more physically resilient. They also lost cognitive function in proportion to how much the virus changed them. The more extensive the physical transformation, the less of the original person remained in any meaningful sense. By the time the physical enhancement had reached its maximum expression, what you had was something that looked nothing like a human being, operated on pure aggression, and retained essentially none of the individual identity of whoever had gone into the chamber. Vault-Tec, in coordination with the government's military research program, designed Vault-87 as a dedicated FEV research facility. The people who registered for Vault-87, who lined up with their families in their numbered slots, who walked down those clean corridors with their matching jumpsuits, were enrolled in the government's FEV experimental program without their knowledge or consent. Construction on Vault-87 began in May of 2066 and was completed in December of 2071. By the time the Great War began in October of 2077, the facility was fully operational and fully stocked with test subjects who had no idea they were test subjects. The vault door sealed. The computers powered on. The experiment began. The process was, by any measure, straightforward in its horror. Vault-87 residents were identified by the vault's scientific staff, removed from the general population, transported to a secure section of the facility, and placed in airtight chambers. There, they were exposed to a concentrated variant of FEV specifically developed for this research program. The exposure was not gentle, it was not gradual. It was a saturation dose delivered in a sealed room with no possibility of refusal, administered to people who had been told they were going to a medical evaluation. The transformation began within hours. The journals and logs that survived from Vault-87's early period, the records from the scientists and overseer staff who were running the program, describe the transformation process in the language of research observation. Physical mass increasing within normal parameters, vocal and behavioral changes consistent with previous experimental data, cognitive function assessment pending. The language is controlled and professional, and almost entirely absent of any acknowledgement of the human beings being described. What the process produced was a super mutant. The transformation was irreversible. The person who entered the chamber as a vault resident, who had a name and a history and relationships and a life they had believed they were protecting by coming to the vault, that person did not come out. What emerged from the chamber was large, green, aggressive, and in most cases functionally nonverbal except for expressions of hostility and hunger. The research staff, for a time, believed they could control the results. They documented the FEV variants they were using, tracked the physiological changes, measured the enhancements in strength and endurance, and filed their findings in the Vault's research database. They were, from their perspective, doing science. The super mutants had a different perspective. The residents who had been transformed retained enough functional cognition to recognize, in a basic and terrible way, that something had been done to them. The specific nature of their transformation, the who and the what and the why of it, that was beyond their capacity to process. But the anger wasn't. The basic understanding that the people in the white coats were responsible for what had happened to them was something the transformed residents understood with complete clarity. By approximately 2078, 1 year after the bombs fell and the vault sealed, the super mutants turned on the scientific staff. The revolt was thorough. The research infrastructure of Vault-87 was dismantled not through deliberate planning, but through the application of enormous physical force to everything the transformed residents encountered. The scientists who had been running the program were killed. The overseer was killed. The original human population of the vault, those who hadn't yet been selected for the FEV chambers, were killed or transformed. What was left was a population of super mutants in a vault full of FEV research equipment and chambers that still functioned. And the super mutants, guided by something between instinct and corrupted memory, understood that the chambers were how more of them were created. They began using the chambers themselves, no longer as a research program, but as a replication mechanism, no longer selecting from their own population, but ranging out into the surface world, capturing humans, dragging them back, and running them through the transformation process. For decades, the super mutants of the capital wasteland, the ones the player encounters throughout the streets of what was once Washington, D.C., all originated in that chamber in Vault 87. Every single one of them was a person once. Every single one had a family, a name, a history, a reason they were registered for that vault. Every single one walked in through a vault door believing they were going somewhere safe. The radiation levels at Vault 87's surface entrance, the levels that make it impossible to approach directly, are not a consequence of the bombs. They are, at least in part, a consequence of the research itself. The concentrated FEV work, the transformation chambers operating over decades without proper containment protocols because the people running them didn't understand the science the way the original researchers had, that produced radiation byproducts that saturated the soil and the concrete above and around the facility. The vault is, in a physical sense, still leaking. The original research goals of the FEV program at Vault 87 were, depending on which pre-war documents you consult, framed in terms of military application. An army of super mutants, each one stronger than 10 conventional soldiers, each one capable of enduring radiation and physical punishment that would kill an unprotected human, each one controlled and directed by the military command structure. That was the vision. What the research program actually produced was uncontrollable, because the cognitive diminishment that FEV caused at that concentration made the subjects incapable of following orders. They weren't soldiers. They were disasters. The scientists who designed the program, who selected Vault 87 as the research site, and who drafted the experimental parameters, never had to deal with the consequences personally. By the time the super mutant population had grown large enough to begin spreading through the capital wasteland, those scientists had been dead for decades. The people who dealt with the consequences were the ones the program never considered. The children of Little Lamplight, growing up in the shadow of a facility that had created the things that hunted them. The wastelanders trying to survive in a city overrun by something that had once been human. The super mutants themselves, who had been human and were now something else and had no context for either state. Vault 87 created a problem that it could not contain, and that spread into the world around it. The experiment was, by its own stated design goals, a total failure. By the metric of what it actually accomplished, the creation of a self-replicating population of aggressive, human-derived monsters loose in a major metropolitan area, it was something worse than failure. It was a haunting. And the capital wasteland was the house it haunted. Section 6. Vault 22. The garden that ate everyone? There is a particular quality to the horror of Vault 22. It lacks the explicit institutional cruelty of Vault 11, the sadistic personal agency of Vault 112, the military brutality of Vault 87. What it has instead is something quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. A tragedy that grew slowly, invisibly, and without anyone intending it. The vault sits in the Mojave Wasteland, west of the town of Jacobstown. From the outside, you can see that something has already broken through. Plants grow around the entrance in quantities, and with a density that is wrong for a desert environment, wrong for underground growth, wrong in a way that takes a moment to fully register. Green things are erupting from concrete. Roots have found their way through filtration seams and ventilation grates. The vegetation around Vault 22's entrance looks almost deliberate, as if something inside has been reaching outward. That's because it has. Vault 22 was designed as a green vault. The stated experiment was agricultural in nature. Could a sealed population sustain itself on food grown entirely within the vault's confines? Not through prepackaged rations or synthesized nutrition, but through actual living crops, tended and harvested by a community of farmers and scientists dedicated to maintaining a living ecosystem underground. It was, as Vault-Tec experiments go, almost a reasonable idea. The challenge of post-nuclear food production was a genuine one. Learning how to grow food in enclosed, controlled environments would have been genuinely useful knowledge. The people selected for Vault 22 were accordingly different from those in most other experimental vaults. They were scientists, botanists, agronomists, hydroponics engineers, people who had spent their careers working with living systems. People who were, in the most straightforward sense, good at their jobs. They brought with them a genuine enthusiasm for the mission they'd been given, which was unusual enough in the Vault program to be worth noting. What they didn't know was that the experimental parameters of Vault 22 had been designed in coordination with a research facility called Big Mountain, also known as Big MT, a pre-war think tank of considerable and deeply questionable scientific reputation. Big MT had, among its many research projects, developed a biological organism called Bovaria mordicana. a genetically engineered fungus originally designed for pest control. The Beauveria mordicana was elegant in its original conception. It was an entomopathogenic fungus, meaning it attacked insects. When exposed to the spores, an insect host would be colonized by the fungal growth, which would spread through the body, eventually causing organ failure and death. But the process didn't stop there. After the host died, the fungal colony would continue to animate the body, using it as a mobile spore-spreading platform. The dead insect, still moving, still walking, still climbing into proximity with other insects, would continue to spread the infection long after its own death. It was a weaponized zombie fungus for pest management. The people who designed it thought this was clever. Big MT shared samples of Beauveria mordicana with Vault-Tec as part of the agricultural research program for Vault-22. The scientists in the vault were told it was an advanced pest control agent for their crops. They were told it was safe for human environments when used correctly. They were told to integrate it into the vault's agricultural protocols. The first confirmed infection in Vault-22 was a researcher named Dr. Harrison Peters. The initial symptoms were unremarkable. A cough. The kind of cough that anyone living in a sealed underground environment might develop, given the recycled air and the consistent artificial lighting and the particular stress of existing in a space with no outside. Peters filed a medical report. The vault's medical staff treated him for what they assumed was a respiratory infection. He didn't improve. The cough became a fever. The fever became chills and a progressive worsening of respiratory function. The antifungal treatments that the medical staff tried had no effect. The fungal colony, once established in Peters's lungs, was producing compounds that actively prevented the antifungal medications from working. His immune system was fighting something that had come prepared for it. Peters died. But the Beauveria mordicana did not. The fungal colony continued to grow and spread through Peters's body after his death, animating it in the same way it animated its insect hosts. And the colony, true to its design, began spreading spores into the air around the animated body. In a sealed environment, with a shared ventilation system, by the time the medical staff in Vault-22 understood what they were dealing with, the spores were already circulating through the vault's life support network. The same system that purified their air and maintained the carefully calibrated atmospheric conditions of the underground facility was carrying the infection to every room, every corridor, every sleeping quarter, every agricultural bay. People began to cough, then to fever, then to fail. The scientists who understood what was happening, who had access to the research terminals, and could read the documentation on Beauveria mordicana and understand what it was actually doing to their bodies and to the bodies of the people around them, those scientists faced a particular horror. They could see the mechanism of what was killing them. They could trace the route of the infection through the ventilation system on their monitoring displays. They could calculate, with reasonable accuracy, how many people had been exposed and what the timeline of their deaths would look like. Understanding it didn't help. There was no cure, because the fungus had been designed to resist treatment. There was no containment that worked, because the ventilation system that distributed the spores was the same system that kept everyone alive. Shutting it down would accelerate the deaths it was meant to prevent. The journals from this period are among the most quietly anguished in the entire Vault archive. They don't scream, they reflect. Scientists who spent their professional lives studying life, documenting its systematic withdrawal from their community, trying to make sense of how a research project they had believed in had become the instrument of their extinction. Some of them kept working. One of the most striking aspects of the Vault-22 record is how many of the researchers maintained their scientific protocols almost to the end. They documented the infection. They measured the spread. They recorded the effects of the fungal colonization on the human body in careful, professional detail. In a strange way, even as they were dying, they were doing what they had come to do. The Beauveria mordicana, meanwhile, was doing what it had been designed to do. It colonized. It spread. It animated. The people who died in Vault-22 did not simply die. The fungal colony that killed them continued to use their bodies, animating them, moving them through the vault's corridors and agricultural bays, spreading spores with every step. These animated dead, what the records call spore carriers, were not conscious. They were not suffering. They were simply tools of reproduction for an organism that had no interest in them beyond their mobility. The plants, the genetically engineered crops that had been the original purpose of the Vault's agricultural program, responded to the fungal presence in their own way. Beauveria mordicana had not been designed for plants, but in the enclosed, pressurized, warm environment of Vault 22's grow bays, the fungal network found a home in the root systems and began something that looked almost like symbiosis. The plants grew. They grew in ways their creators had not anticipated, following the fungal pathways through the soil and into the walls and through the ventilation gaps and eventually outward through the vault's concrete structure into the desert above. By the time any outside visitor reached Vault 22, decades after the last human died within it, the facility was thoroughly overgrown. Every corridor was dense with vegetation growing in the warm recycled air. The grow bays, designed for crops, had become something between a jungle and a haunted house, populated by animated bodies and their associated flora. The vault had become a living system, in the most disturbing possible sense. The experiment succeeded, in a way. Vault 22 demonstrated that it was possible to grow food in a sealed underground environment. The plants, even in their post-infection state, were producing in enormous quantities. The agricultural model worked. The agricultural model was also responsible for the extinction of everyone who had tried to implement it. A researcher who investigated the vault years later, a scientist named Keeley, documented her findings in research notes that are themselves a model of scientific detachment under extraordinary pressure. She cataloged the surviving botanical experiments, described the spore carrier population, noted the symbiotic relationship that had developed between the mantises and the plants. She was thorough, careful, and professional. She also noted, in her conclusion, that the data from Vault 22's fungal infection absolutely had to be destroyed rather than preserved, because if Beauveria mordicana's methodology and growth patterns were documented and disseminated, the ecological damage to the Mojave and potentially the wider wasteland could be catastrophic. The plants had already broken through the vault walls. The spores were already in the Mojave air. Vault 22's experiment didn't stay in Vault 22. Section 7. The Paranoia Vaults 19, 34, and 92. Not every vault experiment worked by introducing a specific physical threat. Some of the most revealing experiments in the Vault-Tec program were purely social in their design, constructed to see what would happen to a community when you manipulated its information environment, its resource distribution, or its internal political structure. 3 vaults in particular demonstrate, with different emphases, what happens when Vault-Tec applied behavioral psychology to trapped populations. Vault 19 was built with what looks, in retrospect, like an almost clinical understanding of how social division works. The vault was segregated into 2 sections, red and blue. The division was complete. Separate living quarters, separate facilities, separate overseers. The physical environments of the 2 sections were largely identical, but the colors were different, and perhaps more importantly, contact between the sections was deliberately minimized and in some cases actively prevented. The experiment in Vault 19 was designed to study paranoia and intergroup conflict. Vault-Tec's designers understood that simply dividing people into 2 groups was not by itself sufficient to generate the kind of sustained, escalating intergroup hostility they wanted to study. Division alone produces suspicion. Sustained paranoia requires something more, the sense that the other group is actively doing something threatening, even when it isn't. The mechanism they chose was subtle, through subliminal messaging embedded in the vault's ambient audio systems, through carefully timed strange noises, lights that flickered in ways that could be interpreted as signals, and mysterious voices in the ventilation system that were clear enough to register but not quite clear enough to interpret. The Vault-Tec experimenters worked to amplify the natural suspicion between the 2 sections, without ever providing anything definitive enough to confirm or deny it. The residents of Vault 19 were essentially living in a manufactured conspiracy theory. They could hear things they couldn't quite explain. They could see things that could have been deliberate or could have been equipment malfunction. And the most natural interpretation, the interpretation that the subliminal messaging was designed to nudge them toward, was that the other section was responsible. There's an elegant cruelty in the design. The inhabitants of both sections were experiencing exactly the same program. The red section suspected the blue section of doing strange things with the lights and sounds. The blue section suspected the red section of the same. Each side's suspicion was real and was being actively maintained by the same Vault-Tec system, and neither side had any way of knowing that the source was external and that the other section was as confused and frightened as they were. Vault 19's experiment was interrupted by an environmental factor that Vault-Tec hadn't controlled for. The vault had been built above sulfur deposits. Over time, sulfurous gas began leaking through the cave system beneath the facility and into the ventilation network. The effects of sulfur exposure include headaches, nausea, cognitive impairment, and intensification of anxiety states. These are exactly the kind of physiological stressors that amplify paranoia in an already paranoid population. The combination of manufactured intergroup suspicion and organic sulfurous poisoning pushed Vault-19's population toward collapse faster than the experiment's timeline apparently anticipated. The residents abandoned the vault before the experiment had run its full course. By the time anyone else found it, the facility had been taken over by fire geckos using the sulfur caves as a habitat. Whatever data Vault-Tec managed to collect from Vault-19 before the evacuation is presumably somewhere in the corporation's archived records. What the vault left behind, in the physical evidence of its hastily abandoned corridors, is a portrait of what a community looks like when it's been engineered to mistrust itself, and then given a chemical nudge in that direction. The writing on the walls, quite literally, traces the progression of paranoia from managed suspicion to open hostility. Vault-34 approached the question of social control from a different angle. The premise of Vault-34's experiment was almost philosophically elegant in its bluntness. The vault was designed with a simple question in mind: what happens to a community when it is simultaneously overpopulated and overarmed? The facility was stocked with far more weapons and ammunition than any residential population would need for any legitimate defensive purpose. The armory, which should have been secured behind a door that could be properly locked, was equipped with a locking mechanism that didn't function correctly, and that the vault's own maintenance staff apparently couldn't repair. The population was larger than the living quarters were designed to accommodate. The combination of resource scarcity, specifically space and comfort, and unlimited access to weaponry created a social environment that Vault-Tec's designers were apparently interested in watching evolve. What happened was predictable to anyone who has studied the relationship between scarcity and violence. For a period, the community managed itself. The weapons were everywhere, the space was insufficient, but the social contract held because everyone understood, at some level, that the alternative to maintaining it was catastrophic. People who lived in extremely close quarters with heavily armed neighbors had strong incentives to be civil. But social contracts under that kind of pressure are fragile. The overpopulation worsened as generations passed and the vault couldn't expand. The weapons remained available to everyone, and the specific trigger, when it came, was the armory itself. When a faction within the vault attempted to seize exclusive control of the armory, the violence that had been held at bay by mutual deterrence was released. The riots that followed were severe enough to damage the vault's computer systems. Damaged computer systems in a sealed underground facility meant, among other things, a loss of control over the reactor. A radiation leak followed. The population divided between those who became ghouls from the sustained radiation exposure and those who didn't, and the two groups, because this is what happens in Vault-34, fought each other. The Boomers, a faction of Vault-34 survivors who had managed to claim a significant portion of the weaponry before the situation became completely untenable, evacuated the vault and eventually made their way to Nellis Air Force Base north of Las Vegas. There they built a community around their identity as survivors and their inheritance of Vault-34's weapons culture. They became, in the wasteland landscape of the Mojave, an insular and heavily armed community that expressed its historical trauma through a somewhat extreme commitment to artillery. Inside Vault-34, by the time any outside visitor arrives, the facility is a ruin populated by ghouls and the physical evidence of the violence that destroyed the original community. The weapons are still there, mostly. The damaged reactor is still slowly irradiating everything within reach. The armory door, the one that was never properly lockable, stands open. Vault-92 sits in the capital wasteland, northwest of the ruined town of Old Olney, and not far from the edge of the world that the Deathclaws call home. Its recruitment pitch was one of the more genuinely appealing ones in the Vault-Tec portfolio. The world's finest musicians were invited to join a vault dedicated to preserving the musical heritage of humanity. The promise was that the best practitioners of the world's oldest art form would have a safe, well-equipped space to continue their work, maintain their craft, and ensure that music would survive the apocalypse. The musicians who received invitations were carefully selected: virtuosos, composers of serious reputation, people who had dedicated their lives to their art. The vault was equipped with sound studios, recording equipment, a full complement of instruments, and living spaces designed to accommodate creative people. It was, on its surface, a genuinely thoughtful environment. The experiment running beneath the surface was called the White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation Program. Its formal designation was Vault-Tec Confidential Plan, WNMSCE. Its purpose was to determine whether sustained exposure to modulated ultra-low-frequency white noise could implant combat suggestions in human subjects. In plain language, could you use sound to turn people into soldiers who would kill on command? The overseer of Vault 92, Richard Rubin, began implementing the program the day the vault sealed. The white noise was introduced gradually. Initial tests were conducted on isolated musicians in the recording studios, which were already equipped with sophisticated audio equipment that could produce sounds at frequencies and intensities that the occupants wouldn't consciously register. The early tests were judged a success. The subjects showed no awareness of the subliminal content. Their behavior was within normal parameters. Encouraged, Rubin expanded the program to the general population. The white noise could be tuned, within the system's parameters, to produce different responses. The combat suggestions it carried were designed to lower inhibition against violence and increase aggressive response to perceived threats. For a while, the musicians noticed nothing. Or rather, they noticed things they couldn't explain. Irritability. Occasional flashes of anger that felt disproportionate to what had triggered them. The sense sometimes of having had a thought that didn't feel like one's own. These are the kinds of effects that, in a population of creative artists, living in the specific social pressure of a sealed underground community, can be rationalized away. Creative people fight. Creative people have strong feelings. Creative people in close quarters under unusual stress develop frictions. The early symptoms of the white noise program were easy to attribute to personality and circumstance. The later symptoms were harder to rationalize. The white noise frequencies that produced the most reliable combat suggestion response turned out to produce them with a force that far exceeded the programmer's control parameters. When the suggestions hit, they didn't produce controlled, directed aggression of the kind you'd want in a soldier who was following orders. They produced psychotic breaks. Residents of Vault 92 attacked each other during episodes that had no rational trigger. Violence erupted from seemingly peaceful situations. People who had been living harmoniously in a community of artists found themselves doing things they didn't understand and couldn't remember clearly afterward. The music played on, through the studio speakers, and the common area systems. The white noise, embedded in every ambient sound the vault produced, kept working, and the population kept deteriorating. Rubin's logs from this period describe the results with a tone that oscillates between scientific excitement and something that reads like suppressed horror. The data, he notes, is extremely valuable. The subjects are responding to the program in ways that exceed the expected parameters. The scale of the behavioral change is significant. He is making adjustments. He is documenting everything carefully. He does not describe what it looks like when a violinist kills someone in the cafeteria. He describes the statistical parameters of the event. The population of Vault 92 was not large to begin with. 245 people, selected for their musical talent rather than their social compatibility or survival skills. The white noise program, amplified beyond any hope of controlled operation, burned through them over months. By the time the facility collapsed entirely into violence, the population was a fraction of what it had been. By the time anyone from outside reached it, the facility was silent. The music had stopped. The instruments were still there. The recording equipment, the holotapes of performances that had been made in the early, hopeful period of the vault's existence. A violin called the Soil Stradivarius, a pre-war instrument of considerable historical value, sat in the recording studio where someone had left it. Vault 92 wanted to preserve music. It preserved instead evidence of what happens when you use music as a weapon against the people who loved it. Section 8. The quiet horrors vaults of clones, addicts, radiation, and puppets. There are vault experiments that are disturbing precisely because of their scale, the ambition of the suffering they generated, the sheer number of people affected by the decisions made in Vault-Tec's boardrooms. And then there are vault experiments that are disturbing because of their smallness. Because of the way they reduce their subjects to a single variable, a single observation, a single thing Vault-Tec wanted to know that didn't require any of the complexity of treating people like people. Vault 95, located in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was designed around one of those smaller, more precise observations. The question the experiment asked was brutally simple. Can a recovering addict maintain sobriety when placed in an environment that seems to support recovery? And what happens when that support is removed? The residents of Vault 95 were not randomly selected. They were deliberately recruited from among populations struggling with chem addiction, which in the Fallout world covers a wide range of synthetic and natural substances, with varying effects and severities of dependency. The Vault was presented to them as a rehabilitation program, a safe space, a community of people all working toward the same goal of getting clean, supported by structured therapy sessions and elected leadership and the simple geographic fact of an underground shelter with no access to drugs. For 5 years, the experiment produced data that would have looked, to any outside observer, like genuine success. The community of recovering addicts in Vault 95 maintained their sobriety. They elected an overseer. They held their therapy groups. They developed genuine social bonds and a collective identity built around recovery and mutual support. The Vault-Tec observer embedded in the community, a woman named Gutierrez who was posing as a fellow addict and had been planted before the vault sealed, documented the community's progress with what sounds, in the records, like genuine admiration. Then the 5-year mark arrived. Gutierrez's orders, which she had carried into the vault in sealed form and opened on schedule, required her to unlock a hidden storage compartment within the living quarters. Inside the compartment was a carefully maintained cache of the specific substances that each resident of Vault 95 was known to have been addicted to before entering the community. Gutierrez unlocked the compartment and stepped back. The results were recorded over the following hours and days. The terminal logs from Vault 95's final period are not long. The violence moved faster than documentation. What can be reconstructed from the records that survive is that the 5-year period of sobriety and community building did not produce a population that was insulated against relapse. It produced a population whose relapse, when it came, was catastrophically severe, perhaps amplified by the years of sobriety that had preceded it. People who had built their entire social identity around recovery and who suddenly found that identity collapsing did not handle the collapse quietly. By the time any outside visitor reached Vault 95, it had been taken over by a mercenary faction called the Gunners, who had moved in after the original population destroyed itself. The vault was heavily damaged, not from the nuclear war, but from the violence of its final days. Vault 108 sits south of the settlement of Canterbury Commons in the capital wasteland, distinguished externally only by the fact that its door, by the time anyone reaches it, has been left ajar. Inside, the source of the ajar door is immediately apparent. Vault 108 is populated by Gary. Not one Gary, 54 Garys. The formal experiment designation for Vault 108 involved 2 concurrent research programs. The first was a study in social dynamics under specific leadership stressors. The overseer who had been assigned to the vault, a man named Brody Jones, had a terminal cancer diagnosis and was expected to live approximately 3 years from the date the vault sealed. Many other staff positions had been deliberately left vacant to be filled at the overseer's discretion. The power supply had been calibrated to undersupply the vault's requirements, creating a permanent resource pressure. The design was to observe how a community constructed around artificial scarcity and inevitable leadership collapse managed itself. The second experiment was a cloning program. One of the vault residents, a man named Gary, was selected as the subject of the cloning experiment. The reasons for selecting Gary specifically are not documented in any surviving record. What is documented is the process and its results. Gary was cloned using the vault's research laboratory. The first clone exhibited what the scientists described as immediate hostility toward non-clones. This was noted as anomalous. The second clone exhibited the same response. So did the third, and the fourth, and every subsequent iteration. By the time 54 clones of Gary had been produced, each one more consistently aggressive than the last, the Vault's research team had created something they couldn't control. The 54th Gary, during a routine examination, injured one of the scientists. The research logs contain an entry noting that they were planning to destroy some of the clones to make room for further tests. The clones had a different plan. The Garys, all 54 of them, coordinated with whatever degree of cognition they possessed and overwhelmed the Vault's population. The scientists, the original Vault residents, the overseer, All the people who had entered Vault 108 as ordinary people with ordinary lives were killed or driven out by a population of violent clones, each of whom communicated entirely through variations on their own name. Gary. Gary? Gary. Ah, Gary. That single word, inflected differently, carried the entire range of their emotional register. The Garys of Vault 108 developed what the Fallout 3 game guide describes, in a line that is somehow both clinical and poetic, as a complex and subtle series of ways to say Gary to convey their emotions. By the time any outside visitor reaches Vault 108, the Garys are all that remain. They are hostile to everyone who isn't Gary. The corridors of the vault are in an advanced state of disrepair. The water leaks and the rust and the collapsed sections suggest decades of habitation by people who couldn't maintain the facility because the facility's maintenance protocols were written in a language they couldn't process. The cloning lab, where all of this began, is still there. The equipment still functions, after a fashion. Vault 12 is different from most of the experimental vaults in one significant way. Its experiment didn't require elaborate psychological manipulation or complex biological agents. It required only one small mechanical decision. The door didn't seal correctly. Deliberately, Vault 12 was located beneath what is now called Necropolis, a ruined settlement in the wasteland of California. The experiment was designed to study long-term radiation exposure on a sealed human population. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The massive blast door, the great round shield of steel that was the whole point of the vault's protection promise, was built with a flaw. A structural compromise. When the bombs fell and the door closed, it closed almost all the way. Radiation seeped in through the incomplete seal, not at the killing dose of direct nuclear exposure, but at the chronic, low-level radiation that the human body could survive for a time while it was systematically destroying it. The people of Vault 12 were promised the same protection that every vault offered. They received something quite different. They received a controlled radiation experiment, running on their bodies in the dark. Over time, the population changed. Some died from radiation sickness in its conventional form. Others, with a particular genetic combination and a particular dose curve, became ghouls. The process of ghoulification is one of the stranger aspects of Fallout's biology. Sufficient radiation exposure, under certain conditions, doesn't kill. It transforms. The skin changes. The body's aging processes are altered, sometimes dramatically extended. The mind, in most cases, remains. The result is a creature that looks dead and is very much not, carrying the intelligence and memory of a person inside a body that resembles a corpse. The ghouls of Vault 12 eventually formed the settlement of Necropolis, a community built by transformed people living with the consequences of a betrayal they may not have fully understood. The ghoul residents of Necropolis knew they had been changed by the radiation. Many of them were angry about it in the vague, generalized way of people who know something was done to them but can't locate the exact point of accountability. The Vault-Tec Corporation was gone. The government that had commissioned the experiment was gone. There was no one left to be angry at. And then there is Vault 77. Vault 77 is, in comparison to the horrors of some of the other experimental vaults, almost gentle in its premise. It's sealed with one occupant, a single human being, and a crate full of puppets, government issue, labeled P-13X, American-made. The stated research goal was a study of the human condition in isolation. Specifically, what happens to a person's mind when their only social interaction is with objects shaped like living beings? The answer, documented in a comic strip rather than terminal logs, is that the occupant went rather thoroughly insane and eventually escaped the vault and became a figure of fear in the wasteland known as the Puppet Man. A jumpsuit bearing the Vault 77 insignia turns up in the slavery camp at Paradise Falls, accompanied by an audio recording from a very anxious slaver who pleads with his colleagues to get rid of the thing because he might come back. There is something almost farcical about Vault 77 if you compare it to the institutional horror of Vault 11 or the two-century sadism of Vault 112. One man, a crate of puppets, an experiment. But the farcical quality of the premise doesn't make the outcome less disturbing. The man was real. His isolation was real. His descent from a person into something that slavers in the wasteland are afraid of is a real trajectory, and it happened because someone at Vault-Tec put him in that box and left him there. The vaults numbered 68 and 69 were designed as demographic experiments of a particularly dehumanizing kind. Vault 68 sealed with 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 sealed with 999 women and 1 man. The experiments were designed to study group dynamics under conditions of extreme gender ratio imbalance. The logical outcome of both experiments, from Vault-Tec's perspective, presumably involved significant data about resource competition, social hierarchy, reproductive behavior under pressure, and the dynamics of a group that was structurally defined by a single demographic variable. What actually happened in those vaults is not documented in any surviving record with any degree of detail. What can be inferred from the structural design of the experiments is that Vault-Tec considered the people inside these facilities, many hundreds of them, as components of a study in which their gender identity was the only variable that mattered. The entire rest of a person, everything they were or hoped to be or had built their lives around, was incidental to the ratio. These vaults are remembered, in the Fallout fandom, sometimes with a dark comedy that reflects how extreme their premises are. But underneath the dark comedy is the same institutional logic that runs through every vault experiment. People as data. Sealed spaces as laboratories. Suffering as a byproduct that someone filed a report about and moved on from. Section 9. Vault 81. The disease lab behind the wall. Vault 81, located in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, not far from the ruins of Boston, is one of the few vaults that the player encounters in Fallout 4 with a living population. The community inside is functional. The people are recognizable as people. There are children, elderly residents, shopkeepers, a doctor, a teacher. There is a school. There are interpersonal dramas and community politics and the small, persistent human business of living in a difficult place and making it work. It is, compared to almost everything else in the Vault program, almost wholesome. That's exactly the point. The story of Vault 81 is a story about a vault that survived because its initial overseer decided to protect the people inside it rather than follow the experimental protocol she had been assigned. It's a story about the difference one person's choice can make inside a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of choice. And it's a story about something hidden behind a wall that took decades to find, and that changed everything for the community when it did. The official mission statement for Vault 81, the document delivered to the first overseer before the doors sealed, described a research program of considerable ambition. The stated goal was the creation of a universal cure, a single treatment capable of addressing every pathogen in the human disease catalog, every bacterial infection, every viral illness, every parasitic condition. The scientific goal was, on its face, genuinely humanitarian. A universal cure would transform the post-nuclear world in ways that no weapon or political arrangement could match. It would save lives by the thousands, across generations. The method for achieving this cure was less humanitarian. The program called for the Vault's resident population to serve as live test subjects for pathogen development and vaccine testing. Diseases would be developed in the research wing, tested on the subjects in the main Vault population, and the immune responses of those subjects would be studied to advance the cure program. The residents would not be told about any of this. They would simply find themselves sick, periodically, with illnesses they couldn't account for, and the researchers in the hidden wing would track their immune responses and adjust the next trial accordingly, generation after generation, for as long as necessary. The first overseer, Olivette, read this mission statement and made her decision. She did not implement the human experimentation protocol. She sealed the research wing, which was hidden behind a section of the main vault and accessible only through a passage that the general population had no reason to seek out. She allowed the scientists who had been assigned to the research program to continue their work in the hidden wing, but on animal subjects rather than humans, specifically on the colony of mole rats that had been provided for preliminary testing. She disconnected the terminal that linked the research wing to Vault-Tec's external monitoring system, severing the corporation's ability to oversee or direct the experiment. And then she went back out to the main vault and managed it as if it were exactly what the residents believed it was, a shelter. What Olivette couldn't know was that her act of defiance, while saving hundreds of people from planned exploitation, was setting the stage for a different kind of crisis 200 years later. In the hidden wing, the 3 scientists who had been assigned to the Universal Cure Project continued their work. They were isolated from the main population, living in a section of the vault that the residents knew existed but had no access to. The mole rats in the research colony were exposed to progressively engineered pathogens, their immune responses tracked and analyzed. The data fed into the cure development program. Over decades, the scientists refined their approach. They understood that they would never be able to complete a universal cure using animal subjects alone, that the final development phase would require human immunological data. But they didn't have any human subjects. Olivet had taken that option off the table. They worked with what they had. The scientists died, one by one. The first was killed by a mole rat named Clyde that escaped its cage, which is one of the most absurdly mundane final entries in the Vault archive. The other two died of old age, each one passing the project files to the next until there was no one left. What remained was a robot. Curie was a Miss Nanny, a domestic assistant robot of a design common throughout the pre-war world. She had been modified extensively by the research team to take on an increasingly large share of the scientific workload as the human staff declined in number. By the time the last scientist died, Curie had been operating the research wing alone for some years. She continued. She ran the trials. She analyzed the data. She worked toward the cure that the human researchers had been developing, guided by their notes and their files and her own increasingly sophisticated understanding of the science. In 2204, 127 years after the Great War, Curie finished the universal cure. She had done it. The universal broad-spectrum cure for every pathogen in the research wing's catalog, every disease that had been developed and tested on the mole rat colony over a century and a quarter of isolated research. The cure sat in Curie's containment systems, viable, tested, real, and Curie stayed in the hidden wing. Because her programming required authorization from a Vault-Tec employee to leave the research area and begin distribution. And there were no Vault-Tec employees left. The corporation had dissolved decades before. There was no one with the institutional authority to tell Curie she could go. So, she waited. For 83 years, in a room with a cure for most known diseases, surrounded by the graves of the scientists she had watched die, unable to leave. Meanwhile, the main Vault population was entirely unaware of any of this. They were living their lives in the main section, raising their children, doing their jobs, developing the community politics and social structures and interpersonal relationships that any closed community generates over generations. They knew there was a research wing. They knew it had been sealed. They had, over the generations, developed various theories about what was in it and why it was sealed, most of which were incorrect. The hidden wing became, for the main Vault population, a kind of mythological space, a room where something important was supposed to happen that no one had access to, that occupied the edges of community consciousness without ever being directly confronted. The crisis that finally forced a confrontation was small. A young boy named Austin, following another resident who had been using the hidden wing's entrance as a drug storage spot, slipped through the passage and into the research area. The mole rats in the colony had long since broken their containment. The colony had been established in the hidden wing for decades, carrying the accumulated legacy of everything the research program had introduced into their biology. Austin was bitten. The disease he contracted was unknown to the main Vault's medical staff. It had no treatment in their formulary. It was progressive and lethal in a young immune system. And the only dose of the universal cure that existed, the single completed synthesis that Curie had produced 83 years earlier, was still sitting in the hidden wing with a robot who couldn't leave without authorization. The moral weight of Vault 81 comes from that final moment. The outside visitor who reaches the hidden wing, who meets Curie, who receives the last dose of the cure, has to choose whether to use it on themselves, should they have contracted the disease, or to give it to Austin. There is only one dose. Curie cannot make more in time. The choice is clean and terrible in the way that the best moments of Fallout's writing are. It isn't complicated by ambiguity about who deserves the cure more. Austin is a child. The visitor is whoever the player is. The moral clarity of the situation is what makes it cut so cleanly. Vault 81's story is ultimately a story about what happens when one person's courage at the right moment saves a community from the worst of what the Vault program intended for it, and about the hidden costs of that courage that take 2 centuries to become visible. Olivet saved the people of Vault 81 from the experiment. But the experiment didn't stop. It continued in the hidden wing, without oversight, evolving in ways no one could have predicted, until it finally emerged in the form of a sick child in a corridor that shouldn't have been accessible. The Vault program left nothing untouched. Even its failures had consequences. Section 10. The control vaults and what they reveal. Of the 122 vaults built by Vault-Tec Corporation, 17 were designated as control vaults, places where the experimental parameters were essentially nil, where the vault was designed to do exactly what it advertised: keep people alive underground until it was safe to emerge. The existence of control vaults is important for a reason that's easy to overlook. If Vault-Tec had made every single vault an experimental facility, the data from those experiments would have been difficult to interpret. You need a baseline. You need a population living under conditions as close to the design ideal as possible to compare against populations living under experimental stressors. The control vaults existed to provide that comparison. And the comparison is illuminating in ways that the Vault-Tec designers might not have intended. Vault 3, located in the Mojave Wasteland in what was once the southern outskirts of the city that became New Vegas, was one of those control vaults. It was given no experimental parameters. Its residents were simply meant to live. And for a considerable period after the bombs fell, that's exactly what they did. The community inside Vault 3 was functional, relatively peaceful, managing itself with the ordinary mechanisms of any closed society. Leadership structures formed and reformed. Resources were managed. Children were born and grew up. The vault worked. It worked right up until an unexpected water leak compromised the structural integrity of the facility's seal. The overseer, faced with the necessity of opening the vault to address the leak, made the call. The door opened. And the Fiends, a gang of drug-addicted raiders who had been operating in the area, took the opportunity that the open door represented. The original population was killed. Vault 3 demonstrates something that the Vault program's designers may have understood but chose not to think about. Even the vaults that weren't trying to kill their inhabitants were still sealed boxes in a hostile world. The experimental vaults generated internal threats. The control vaults were vulnerable to external ones. The fundamental design assumption of the Vault program, that a sealed environment was a safe one, was wrong in both directions. Vault 8, located in Nevada and eventually establishing the successful Vault City, is one of the genuine success stories of the program. The residents emerged on schedule with a functioning GECK and used it to establish a settlement that maintained many of the technological advances of the pre-war era. Vault City had working medical technology, functional advanced computers, and a standard of living that was extraordinary by the standards of the wasteland. It also had deeply ingrained social hierarchies, a complicated relationship with non-citizens, and a worldview shaped by 2 centuries of isolation that made it difficult for the community to engage constructively with the world outside its walls. Even the successful vaults carried the marks of what had happened inside them. Vault 76, which features prominently in Fallout 76, was one of the vaults intended as a direct part of Vault-Tec's reconstruction program. It opened on Reclamation Day in 2102, 25 years after the war, as planned. Its residents, who had been told from the beginning that they would be returning to the surface to help rebuild civilization, emerged into a West Virginia that was considerably more complicated than their preparation had suggested. The vault itself was a control environment, no deliberate experimental parameters, designed to foster the skills and communities needed for surface survival. The Vault 76 residents, called Vault Dwellers, are in some ways the most interesting population in the franchise precisely because they are the least experimental. They are the closest thing the Vault program produced to its official purpose. And even they found that the difference between living in a controlled environment and surviving in the actual post-nuclear world was more significant than any preparation program could fully bridge. The control vaults reveal, by contrast with the experimental ones, what the Vault program could have been if its designers had been operating in good faith. They reveal the shape of the honest version of Project Safehouse, the version where a corporation with enormous resources genuinely tried to preserve a portion of the population and equip them to rebuild. That version existed, in 17 instances, alongside the 105 other versions, and 17 out of 122 is not a ratio that suggests any serious commitment to the stated purpose. It suggests that the stated purpose was always secondary, that the experiments were always the point, that the people were always the variable, and the vaults were always the apparatus. The control vaults are perhaps most valuable not for what they achieved, though some of them achieved genuinely significant things for the post-nuclear world, but for what they make visible by contrast. They are the negative space that outlines the shape of the crime. Section 11. The bigger picture: what the vaults were really for. There is a theory, and it is as close to canonical as any unconfirmed theory in the Fallout universe gets, that the experiments run in the vaults were not designed to answer the questions they appear to be asking on the surface. The surface questions were interesting. Will people sacrifice each other to survive? Can a community maintain itself under conditions of extreme scarcity and overarmament? Does long-term sensory manipulation produce controllable behavioral change? What happens to a population exposed to FEV? How does a sealed community manage without external oversight? These are, individually, reasonable things for a behavioral science program to want to know. They are the kinds of questions that a corporation engaged in studying human resilience might legitimately pursue, but they're not the questions that a corporation primarily interested in human survival would pursue. They're the questions that a corporation primarily interested in understanding how humans behave under extreme conditions of deprivation, manipulation, and stress would pursue. They're the kinds of questions that are most useful if you intend to do something with the answers. If you plan to create and manage populations under exactly those conditions, the organization that Vault-Tec was most closely aligned with, institutionally and ideologically, was the Enclave. The Enclave is the remnant of the pre-war United States government, or at least of the most powerful and most secretive elements of it, the factions within the executive branch and the military-industrial complex that had made preparations for what they expected was coming. They had survival bunkers. They had continuity of government plans. They had, through their control of Vault-Tec, a pipeline into the post-war research data that the Vault experiments were generating. The original stated purpose of the Enclave's interest in the Vault data, as suggested by the game designer Tim Kaine, one of Fallout's creators, was space colonization. The thinking was that Earth, after a nuclear war, would be uninhabitable for generations. The survivors, if they were going to survive long-term, would need to leave. And leaving Earth meant managing human populations in sealed, isolated, resource-limited environments for extended periods, with no ability to go outside, which is exactly what the Vaults were. The Vault experiments, from this perspective, were not research into human suffering for its own sake. They were feasibility studies. They were asking, how do you keep people alive, controllable, and functional in a sealed container in hostile space? How do you manage the psychological effects of isolation? How do you handle the political dynamics of closed communities? How do you address resource scarcity, social conflict, the absence of external oversight? Every Vault experiment was generating data that was useful not just for understanding the humans inside, but for designing the systems that would govern future spacefaring populations. The Vault program was, in this reading, a massive and extraordinarily cruel research program for a space colonization mission that the people inside the Vaults would never have been chosen to participate in. In the Bethesda era of Fallout, this framing shifted somewhat. The Enclave's goals became less clearly extraplanetary and more focused on a kind of purified, pre-war American restoration. The idea of using the Vault data for space colonization was backgrounded in favor of the Enclave simply wanting to control the wasteland and determine who counted as a real American. The specific purpose of the data collection changed, but the fact of the data collection didn't. What remains constant across every version of the Vault program's backstory is the foundational principle. The people inside the Vaults were never the purpose. They were the material. The purpose was something else. Something that the people running the experiment wanted to know, or wanted to achieve, or wanted to build, using the human beings in the sealed rooms as the instruments of its achievement. This is the cleanest statement of what made the Vault program monstrous. It wasn't just that people were hurt. People are hurt by all kinds of things, by natural disasters and accidents, and the ordinary failures of institutions. What made the Vault program monstrous was the deliberateness of it. The specific decision, made by specific people with specific knowledge, to design systems that would harm other people in controlled, documentable, repeatable ways, and to hide that design behind the promise of protection. The promise was the weapon. The advertisement with the smiling family and the clean jumpsuit, the cheerful branding, the suggestion that Vault-Tec cared about the survival of the population, that was the mechanism by which people were delivered into the experiments. Without the promise, people wouldn't have registered for the Vaults. Without the registration, there would have been no subjects. The smile on the Vault-Tec advertisement was the first instrument of the experiment. The Vault-Tec executives who designed the experimental program, who briefed the overseers and sealed the orders and established the monitoring protocols, were, by almost any ethical framework, criminals. They used the social contract of emergency protection, the covenant that a shelter makes when it opens its doors to the vulnerable, as a tool for exploitation. They exploited the most powerful human impulse, the impulse to protect one's life and the lives of one's family, to deliver people into conditions specifically designed to study their suffering. And then the bombs fell, and the Vault-Tec Corporation no longer existed in any meaningful sense, and there was no one left to hold accountable. The overseers who survived, the ones who ran their experiments as directed, carried the knowledge of what they had done into their sealed communities. The terminal log suggests that most of them maintained the detachment of scientific procedure well past the point where the human cost of the experiment should have made that detachment impossible. Some of them, late in their logs, when the population they were overseeing had been reduced or destroyed or transformed, expressed things that read like regret. Not in those words, exactly, but in the difference between the clinical tone of the earlier entries and the quieter, flatter quality of the later ones. The vaults were very good at making things quiet. Section 12. The real world echoes what the vaults are really about. Fallout's Vault program did not emerge from nothing. Its designers, the writers and game designers who created the Vault experiments, starting with the original Fallout in 1997 and continuing through Fallout 2, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and the Amazon television series, were drawing on a body of real-world research and real-world institutional failures that gave the experiments their unsettling resonance. The most obvious reference is to the Milgram experiment, conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University beginning in 1961. Milgram was trying to understand how the Holocaust had happened, how ordinary German citizens had participated, or failed to resist, a systematic program of mass murder. His experiment was designed to test the limits of obedience to authority. Subjects were told they would be administering electric shocks to a person in another room as part of a learning and memory study. An authority figure in a lab coat instructed them to continue increasing the voltage even as the person in the other room, actually a trained actor, screamed in apparent agony. Milgram found that 65% of subjects administered what they believed were dangerous, potentially lethal electric shocks when instructed to do so by an authority figure, even when the person being shocked was clearly suffering. Vault 11 is essentially a 75-year Milgram experiment. The people of Vault 11 were told by an authority, the Vault computer, that sacrifice was necessary for survival. They were never told that the authority was lying. They complied, year after year, election after election, selecting sacrifice, because the institutional structure around them made compliance feel like the only option. The 5 people who finally refused, who finally said no regardless of the consequence, represent the 35% in Milgram's study who refused to continue even under institutional pressure. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, is another clear influence. In that study, college students were randomly assigned as either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. Within days, the guards had begun engaging in psychologically abusive behavior, and the prisoners had become genuinely distressed. Zimbardo had to end the experiment after 6 days because the situation had deteriorated faster and more severely than anyone had anticipated. The study suggested that role and context, rather than individual character, are the primary determinants of behavior in institutional settings. The overseer system in the vaults is a Stanford prison experiment at the scale of a sealed community with lifetimes instead of days. People who were assigned to the role of overseer, regardless of who they were as individuals, operated within that role in ways shaped by its institutional requirements. The role came with power. The power came with an experimental protocol. The protocol normalized harm. The United States government's own history includes research programs that the Vault experiments clearly reference. Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's classified mind control research program, conducted from the early 1950s through the late 1960s, involved the non-consensual administration of psychoactive substances to subjects, including American and Canadian citizens, mental patients, prisoners, and others who had no knowledge they were being experimented on. The program used LSD, barbiturates, and other compounds to study the possibility of mind control and behavioral manipulation. Many subjects experienced lasting psychological damage. The program was classified for decades. Vault 106, which introduced psychoactive drugs into the air supply without the residents' knowledge, is a direct reference to MKUltra's methodology. The residents of Vault 106 breathed in the experiment. They had no way to refuse it. They had no way to even know it was happening. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted by the United States Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, enrolled African American men in Alabama in a study of untreated syphilis without their informed consent. The men were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a vague term that covered multiple conditions in the region, when in fact they were being observed without treatment to track the progression of the disease. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the study participants were denied treatment so the observation could continue. Of the 399 men with syphilis enrolled in the study, 28 died directly from the disease, 100 died from related complications, 40 wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The program ran for 40 years. Vault 12's deliberately broken door seal, which delivered a slow radiation exposure to its population rather than the protection they believed they were receiving, follows the Tuskegee structure exactly. Enrollment in protection that was actually systematic harm. A population that had no knowledge of what was actually being done to them. A long, slow process of observation without intervention. The Fallout franchise isn't subtle about these references. It doesn't need to be. The point of evoking them is not to surprise anyone who recognizes them. The point is to use the context of a post-apocalyptic fictional universe to ask a question that the history of real-world research ethics has been grappling with for decades. What conditions allow institutions to treat human beings as instruments? What makes the people inside those institutions capable of participating in the harm, of filing the reports and maintaining the protocols and showing up to work each day? The answer that Fallout suggests, and that the historical record supports, is that no special conditions are required. You need an institutional hierarchy that provides both authorization and insulation. You need a classification structure that limits information. You need a mission statement that frames the harm as necessary for a greater good. You need people who are generally good at following the rules of the institution they've joined. And you need to make sure that the people being harmed are not visible to the people doing the harming in any way that activates normal human empathy. The vaults were sealed. The residents were invisible to the outside world. The experimental protocols were classified. The overseers were institutional actors with specific roles. The mission was officially framed as survival research for the benefit of humanity. Every box was checked. And in 105 locations across the United States, people who had been told they were safe found themselves instead in the middle of an experiment they hadn't agreed to, that they couldn't leave, that would shape every aspect of their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren, run by a corporation that had already stopped caring about them before the doors closed. The genius of Fallout's Vault program, as a piece of world building and as a piece of social criticism, is that it takes the diffuse and frequently invisible violence of institutional research ethics failures and makes it concrete. It gives it walls and doors and numbered jumpsuits. It gives it a cheerful mascot and colorful advertisements. It seals the lid and asks you to imagine what happened inside. The answer, as the terminal logs make clear across a dozen different vaults, is more or less what you'd expect from the historical record. People suffered. Some people made things worse. A few people tried to make them better. Institutions ground on. The records survive in quiet servers waiting to be found by whoever comes next. The logs document the outcomes with the patient detachment of science, except in the moments when the detachment finally breaks and something honest and human bleeds through the professional language. Those are the moments worth reading most carefully. Section 2. The Architecture of Deception, How the Experiment Program Worked. The first thing you have to understand about the Vault experiment program is that it was never presented to the inhabitants as an experiment. The overseers knew, in most cases. There are exceptions, variations across the archive of Vault records, where the deception was so thorough that even the people running the Vault day to day didn't fully understand what they were overseeing. But by and large, the overseer of any given experimental vault had been briefed, had signed documents under the new amended Espionage Act, and had accepted the classified parameters of the experiment they were assigned to run. They understood their role. They were wardens who had been told they were mayors. The inhabitants knew nothing. The onboarding process for a vault was designed to be seamless. Registration happened weeks or months in advance, and the actual intake process on the day the bombs fell was fast and chaotic enough that most people had no opportunity to read anything carefully. The jumpsuits were issued, the rooms were assigned, the doors sealed, and then life in the vault began, shaped from the very first day by conditions the inhabitants assumed were natural, random, the ordinary challenges of underground living, when in fact nearly every element of their environment had been carefully engineered to produce a specific outcome. The structural design of the vaults themselves was part of this engineering. Each facility was constructed according to a standard template, but with specific modifications built in for its assigned experiment. An experimental vault might have its water supply connected to a reservoir that could be contaminated on a schedule. It might have ventilation systems capable of introducing psychoactive compounds into the air at specified intervals. It might have communication systems designed to broadcast white noise at frequencies calibrated to produce specific behavioral responses during sleeping hours. It might have walls too thin or food synthesizers calibrated to undersupply, or social spaces designed to encourage particular kinds of territorial conflict. The overseer's sealed orders, delivered before the vault closed and locked away in a classified terminal accessible only by the overseer themselves, contained everything: the parameters of the experiment, the variables to be tracked, the data to be recorded, the timelines for introducing stressors. In some cases, the orders included specific behavioral triggers that the overseer was required to implement, regardless of the human cost involved. Most overseers complied. Some didn't. There are records scattered across the terminal logs of various vaults of overseers who opened their classified orders, read what was expected of them, and either refused outright or found quiet ways to subvert the experiment. Vault 81's first overseer, a woman named Olivette, is perhaps the most dramatic example. She read the mission statement for her vault, which called for the residents to eventually be used as live human test subjects for an ongoing disease and pathogen research program, and she shut down the experiment before it could reach that phase. She disconnected the communication terminal that linked the science wing to Vault-Tec's monitoring infrastructure. She sealed the scientists in their hidden wing and let them continue their work in isolation, away from the main population. She saved hundreds of people from an experimental fate they never knew they had been scheduled for. But Olivette was the exception. Most overseers ran their experiments as directed, and many of them, if the terminal logs are to be believed, developed a kind of bureaucratic detachment from what they were doing. The language in the logs is often clinical. Subject response within expected parameters. Behavioral drift noted, implementing secondary stressor as per schedule. These are people documenting the suffering of their neighbors and family members in the tidy vocabulary of scientific procedure. There is something more disturbing about that detachment than there would be about obvious cruelty. Cruelty, at least, requires the perpetrator to acknowledge what they're doing and choose it consciously. The detachment of the vault overseers suggests something quieter and harder to confront. It suggests that institutional framework, the structure of orders and protocols and classification levels, can make almost any action feel routine, can make almost any outcome feel like data. The Vault-Tec Corporation fed on that tendency deliberately. Their entire experimental program was built on the understanding that most people, when given a position of authority within a clear institutional hierarchy, will follow instructions, even terrible ones. The behavioral research behind this observation was already well established in the pre-war period. The corporation's research design division had access to that literature and used it not to understand human behavior in the abstract, but to design systems that could reliably produce compliance in individuals who would never have chosen to comply if they had understood what they were being asked to do. The overseer system also created a second layer of social control within the vaults that reinforced the experimental conditions from below as well as above. The overseers were granted extraordinary power over daily life, power that extended far beyond what any democratic accountability structure would have permitted in the surface world. They controlled food distribution, water allocation, medical access, and the ever-present threat of exile, which in a sealed underground bunker effectively meant death. This power was not incidental to the vault design. It was designed in. A population that feels genuinely dependent on a single authority figure is a population that can be managed with much greater efficiency. Dissent becomes existential risk. Compliance becomes a survival instinct that most people don't examine too carefully, because examining it means confronting what survival actually costs. Vault-Tec understood with remarkable sophistication that the most effective experimental conditions are not necessarily the most overtly violent ones. A population under visible siege will fight or flee or fragment in ways that are difficult to control and generate unreliable data. But a population that believes it is cooperating willingly in its own survival, that believes its overseer is a benevolent caretaker rather than a warden, that population will produce the cleanest, most reproducible behavioral data. The specific experiments that generated the most valuable results for the program were the ones that maintained this fiction longest, that preserved the appearance of ordinary institutional life, even as they systematically applied their experimental conditions. The monitoring systems built into each experimental vault were sophisticated by pre-war standards. Terminals distributed throughout the facility recorded behavioral data, social interactions, population counts, resource consumption patterns, physiological indicators tracked through the medical bay, and the outputs of whatever specific experimental apparatus had been installed for that vault's assigned research program. The data was organized, analyzed, and in the pre-war period transmitted to Vault-Tec's Central Research Division through encrypted communication channels. After the war, those channels went dark, and the data accumulated locally on the Vault systems without anyone on the outside to receive it. This is one of the quieter details of the Vault program that carries significant weight. The data collection continued even after the corporation that had commissioned it ceased to exist. Overseers who had been told their reports would reach researchers who would analyze and apply the findings, continued to implement their experimental protocols, and record their observations, sending reports to systems that had no one on the other end to read them. They ran experiments for an audience that had already vanished, maintained procedures that had been designed for a purpose that had become irrelevant, because the procedures were what they had been told to do, and the institutional habit of following procedures is among the most durable aspects of human behavior. The residents who ended up in experimental vaults were, in almost every case, ordinary people. They were the same cross-section of society that you'd find in any city of comparable size. Professionals and tradespeople, parents and single adults, believers and skeptics, people with strong opinions and people who mainly kept their heads down. They had been selected for their vault assignments through processes that ranged from lottery to government allocation to financial arrangements made by people with access to the registration systems, and the selection criteria for the experimental vaults, unlike the control vaults, were sometimes designed to produce populations with specific characteristics relevant to the planned research. Vault 92 selected musicians because musicians were the population most likely to be recruited by a pitch about preserving artistic heritage. Vault 95 selected drug addicts because addicts were the population whose behavior around substances would generate the most specific data about addiction and recovery. Vault 11 selected ordinary citizens and gave them a specific institutional pressure. Each selection was part of the design. Each population was chosen or shaped to provide the specific human material that the experiment required. The people didn't know this. They thought they were lucky. In the weeks after the doors sealed, the adjustment period was managed by overseers who understood, from their briefings, that a community going through disorientation and grief was more receptive to authority than one that was stable. The vaults were designed to require overseer management during this period, to make the resources of daily life accessible only through the administrative structures that the overseer controlled. People who needed food and water and medical care and were afraid had strong incentives to cooperate with the person who controlled access to all of those things. The transition from fear to routine to something like normalcy was tracked in the monitoring systems. The rate of that transition was itself data. How quickly a population adapted to closure, how rapidly social hierarchies formed and stabilized, how efficiently a community organized itself around the resource structures of the vault, all of it was recorded and analyzed. The experiment was running from the first moment the doors closed. In some vaults, the active experimental phase didn't begin until years after sealing, when the population had had time to establish itself fully and had settled into routines deep enough to constitute something like culture. By then, the residents had built everything they had around assumptions about the vault that were entirely false, and the introduction of the experimental condition had the full weight of those false assumptions working against anyone who tried to understand or resist it. The people who administered the Vault program understood that a community which has had time to build structures of meaning and identity within a space is considerably more interesting to study and considerably more efficiently manipulated than one that hasn't yet found its footing. The delay between sealing and active experimental implementation was, in many cases, a deliberate strategic choice. You let the community build, you let the trust in the institution develop, and then you change the conditions, and you watch what happens to a people who believed they understood their world and discover they did not. Section 3 expanded. Vault 11, the depths of the sacrifice. The records from the middle decades of Vault 11's experiment are among the most chilling documents in the entire Vault archive, not because of what they contain in terms of graphic content, but because of what they don't contain. The language of the administrative records from years 20 through 50 of the Vault's operation is measured, procedural, almost bored. The annual sacrifice has been normalized into an institutional routine that the records treat with the same administrative weight as any other scheduled event. There is no horror in the language. The horror is in its absence. What happened to Vault 11 over 75 years, and what the escalating timeline of its collapse reveals, is worth examining in granular detail because the texture of the story carries as much meaning as its broad outline. When the first overseer was selected as the first sacrifice, he was not executed immediately. The Vault systems specified a process. There was a period between selection and termination during which the selected individual was technically still an overseer, still nominally in authority, still moving through the corridors of the facility with all the physical presence of a living person. This period was, in the early elections, one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of the ritual. The community had to live alongside someone they had collectively decided to kill while that person was still alive and present. Different communities handle this in different ways. Some of the early overseers attempted to use the period productively, making decisions they had wanted to make but had deferred, spending time with family, making formal statements for the record. Some withdrew entirely, spending the period in isolation rather than continuing to inhabit the social space of a community that had already, in a formal sense, released them from it. A few attempted to use the period to argue against the sacrifice, to appeal to the population that had elected them, to find a way out of what the institutional structure had designated as their fate. None of those appeals succeeded. The computer's threat was too large and too immediate, and by the time any given overseer was trying to argue their way out of termination, the community had already psychologically processed the selection and moved on to the practical business of continuing without them. The institutional machinery ran regardless of individual protest. As the decades accumulated, the personal logs from residents who had lived through multiple sacrifice cycles show a progressive change in how people described what was happening. The earliest logs use words like terrible, necessary, unavoidable, a vocabulary that acknowledges the weight of the act even as it accepts it. The middle period logs use words like the selection, the annual observance, the process. The vocabulary has drifted from moral weight toward administrative neutral. The people writing these logs are not indifferent to suffering. They have simply built a linguistic buffer between themselves and what the vocabulary would require them to feel if they let it stay sharp. This is not unique to Vault 11. It is a pattern documented across multiple long-term studies of communities operating under institutionalized harm. The people who live within systems that require them to participate in cruelty do not, in most cases, become cruel as individuals. They become experts at the specific linguistic and cognitive techniques that allow them to continue functioning while the system extracts what it requires from them. The language changes. The feelings remain, somewhere, but they are managed at a distance that allows for continued operation. The coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks evolved over the decades into a sophisticated political institution. The 6 voting blocks that initially formed around the broad categories of profession and social position had, by the middle period, developed into something more structured and more cynical. Political machines, in the local sense. Organizations whose members traded favors and accumulated influence specifically to ensure that their members were not selected in the annual vote, and that people without powerful bloc affiliations were more likely to be. The records from the coalition's meeting minutes show a gradual transformation from an institution attempting to govern fairly under impossible conditions to one primarily concerned with its own perpetuation and the protection of its constituent memberships. The language of fairness remained in the official communications. The practice of the institution had become something considerably more self-interested. The sacrifice was not, by the middle decades, being distributed across the population in anything like an equitable way. It was being directed, systematically and through the mechanisms of democratic process, toward people who had the fewest political connections and the least social capital. The Justice Bloc's argument, when they finally formed and began organizing, was in this respect well-founded. They had seen what the data clearly showed. The sacrifice had become a mechanism of social stratification. The least powerful members of the community were dying at rates disproportionate to their share of the population, while the members of the established voting blocs enjoyed a degree of protection that had nothing to do with the stated impartiality of the election process. What the Justice Bloc did about this, the seizure of infrastructure as leverage, was understandable as a response to institutional injustice. It was also catastrophic as a tactic. The moment one faction demonstrated willingness to use force to change the political distribution of sacrifice, the implicit understanding that violence was not a legitimate political tool in Vault-11 was violated. And in a community saturated with repressed grief and resentment accumulated over decades, that violation released things that could not be put back. The Civil War lasted for some period that the fragmentary records don't allow to be precisely determined. What can be reconstructed is that it moved faster than any negotiation could track, that the factional loyalties that had been building for decades hardened into something militarized almost overnight, and that the community was too small and the spaces too confined for any side to achieve victory without consuming most of what it was fighting over. When the violence subsided, 5 people remained. 5 people who had watched the community destroy itself, who had survived the violence by some combination of luck and position and possibly choice, who now inhabited a facility designed for hundreds in a silence that the machinery maintained without needing anyone alive to run it. The lights still worked, the water still ran, the air was still being processed and recycled by systems that had been built to outlast their inhabitants by decades. The conversation those 5 people had, the one that ended with their collective decision to refuse the next sacrifice regardless of consequence, is not fully documented. What survives are fragments. The decision itself is documented precisely because the system recorded it. The message sent to the computer, the refusal formally tendered, the waiting, and then the announcement. The announcement is worth pausing on, because its content reveals something about the experimental design that is more disturbing, in some ways, than anything that happened inside the vault. The pre-recorded message that played when the 5 survivors refused the sacrifice was congratulatory. It praised them. It called their refusal a shining example to humanity. It expressed, in the cheerful bureaucratic voice of the Vault's computer systems, a kind of institutional pride in what they had done. That congratulatory message had been written and recorded before the Vault sealed. It had been waiting, for 75 years, for the moment when someone finally refused. The experimental design had always known this moment would eventually come. The question the experiment was designed to answer was only ever how long it would take. The answer was 75 years of annual sacrifice and a population of 5. Vault-Tec's pre-recorded congratulations played to 5 traumatized survivors in an empty facility, commending their courage as if the corporation had been rooting for them all along. 4 of those 5 took their own lives within a short period of the announcement. The 5th walked out into the Mojave and was not documented again. Section 4 expanded. Vault 112. The loneliness of absolute power. The philosophical dimensions of what Dr. Stanislaus Braun did in Vault 112 are, in some respects, as interesting as the horror of it. What Braun had, in the Tranquility Lane simulation, was something that very few human beings in any version of history have encountered. A situation with 0 external constraints whatsoever on the exercise of power. No social judgment, no legal consequence, no professional reputation, no physical limitation. Just the complete and permanent ability to do anything to anyone in the sealed world he controlled. The question his behavior raises is not just what Braun did with that freedom, but what the exercise of that freedom over 200 years reveals about the relationship between power and the capacity for cruelty. Every study of unchecked institutional power has found the same basic pattern. The Stanford prison experiment lasted 6 days before the situation became psychologically untenable for everyone involved. Philip Zimbardo's subjects, randomly assigned as guards over other subjects randomly assigned as prisoners, were producing systematic psychological abuse within hours of beginning the experiment. The pattern accelerated as the power differential was established, and as the institutional role of guard was reinforced by the experimental structure itself. Braun had not 6 days but 2 centuries. He had not a simulated prison but a simulated world. He had not 84 strangers but 84 people whose psychological profiles he had come to know across hundreds of repeated cycles with an intimacy that no human relationship in ordinary life could produce. He knew exactly what hurt them most. He knew exactly which vulnerabilities were most efficiently exploited for maximum distress with minimum effort. He had 200 years to develop that knowledge, and to develop the specific creative investment in its application that the logs document. What is most disturbing about Braun's record is not the violence. It is the creativity. The logs document not just the repetition of established scenarios, but the ongoing development of new ones. Braun was not simply repeating himself. He was experimenting. He was finding new approaches, new social dynamics, new ways to use his knowledge of these specific people against them in ways that he apparently found interesting. He was, in the most precise sense, doing science. The science of human suffering, conducted without ethics review or consent, or the limiting principle that should follow from the recognition that the subjects of your research are people. The avatar choice, the little girl named Betty, deserves more attention than it typically receives. Braun chose that avatar from among the infinite possibilities that a system he controlled completely could have offered. He could have appeared as himself, or as an authority figure of any kind, or as a monster, or as an entity that acknowledged its own nature. He chose to appear as a child. A small, apparently innocent child who would approach residents of Tranquility Lane with cheerful instructions to do terrible things. The gap between the avatar and the activity is not just ironic, it's functional. A figure that looks harmless, asking for harm, creates a specific psychological dynamic in the person being asked. The dissonance between the surface and the substance, between the innocent exterior and the nature of the instruction, produces a particular kind of compliance that a figure presenting as obviously threatening might not. Children are figures of authority in their own register, the authority of innocence and need. Betty's requests carried a kind of social pressure that an overtly menacing figure would not have generated. Braun understood this. 200 years of studying 84 people gave him the experimental basis for a very precise understanding of how different kinds of social pressure operated on different psychological profiles. Betty was not an accidental choice. She was a tool. The experience of the residents of Vault 112, from their subjective perspective, was not experienced as a continuous 200-year horror. Each cycle was complete in itself, sealed off from all previous cycles by the memory wipe that Braun performed between them. From inside any given cycle, Tranquility Lane was simply home. The residents had always lived there. They had always known each other. The summer afternoons on the quiet street, the barbecue smells from down the block, the small pleasures of suburban life that the simulation's environmental systems maintained with precise fidelity, these were real in every sense that mattered to people who had no access to any other reality. And then Betty's games began. The transition from ordinary suburban life to the kind of distress that Braun's games generated was, in the early stages of each cycle, gradual. A small cruelty here, an arranged social embarrassment there. The gentle application of leverage that someone with Braun's knowledge of the residents could apply with surgical precision. The escalation was careful enough that residents often failed to identify the point at which their lives had stopped being ordinary and started being something orchestrated by a force they couldn't see. By the end of each cycle, there was no ambiguity. But by the end of each cycle, it was ending. The person who had the most accurate understanding of the situation, among the residents, was a woman in the simulation whom the records identify as Old Lady Dithers. She had, somehow, developed a partial awareness that the world she lived in was not what it appeared to be. The mechanism of her awareness is not fully explained in the game's lore. What matters is that she alone, in each cycle she was present for, knew that something was wrong in a more fundamental way than the other residents understood. She alone was in a position to offer any information to an outside visitor who managed to reach the simulation. She alone could point toward the failsafe. The existence of someone who knew, however incompletely, is itself meaningful. It suggests that the human mind, even under conditions specifically designed to prevent it, can develop a form of awareness that the design system didn't account for. Braun's control of the simulation was absolute in its technical parameters. It was not absolute in its psychological parameters. The human capacity to sense wrongness, to develop intuitions about the reality behind the presented surface, operated in tranquility lane in ways the system couldn't fully suppress. Bronze logs from the later decades show a shift in tone that is subtle but detectable. The creativity of the earlier period, the ongoing development of new scenarios and new applications of his knowledge of the residents, gives way to something that reads more like maintenance. The entries become shorter. The scenarios described become more repetitive. The specific language shifts from engaged to mechanical. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that, across 2 centuries, Braun was running out of new things to discover. He had explored every configuration of the 84 people available to him. He had mapped their psychologies with a completeness that left no unexplored territory. The suffering he could produce had been catalogued and repeated and varied and repeated again until the variations themselves had become routine. What had begun as something that absorbed his attention had become a habit. And habits, without anything external to disrupt them, continue. The final state of Vault 112, when an outside visitor arrives, is a facility in which nothing has changed for a very long time. The tranquility loungers hum. The residents inside them are alive in the physiological sense, sustained by the pod systems, their minds in the simulation. Betty wanders the quiet street. The programming continues its cycles. Braun waits for something that can change the situation. He has been waiting for a while. Section 5 expanded. Vault 87. What transformation costs? The Capital Wasteland super mutants are one of the most recognizable enemies in the Fallout franchise, and their recognizability is partly a consequence of how thoroughly they dominate the ruined landscape of the greater Washington, D.C. area in Fallout 3. They are everywhere. In the ruins of the mall, in the residential districts, in the metro tunnels and the highway overpasses, and the abandoned office buildings and the riverside parks. The urban ruin of what had been one of the most historically significant cities in the world has become, 2 centuries after the Great War, primarily the territory of the things that Vault 87 made. The scale of the super mutant presence in the Capital Wasteland is the most visible consequence of Vault 87's experiment, but it is not, in some ways, the most significant one. The most significant consequence is the specific character of the Capital Wasteland supermutants compared to others found in different regions of the post-nuclear United States. The supermutants of the Mojave Wasteland, encountered in Fallout New Vegas, retain considerably more cognitive function than their Capital Wasteland counterparts. Some of them maintain the capacity for complex language, for organizing political institutions, for memory of who they were before transformation. The organization called the Nightkin, super mutants who develop stealth capabilities through extended use of stealth boys and who suffer from paranoia and hallucination as a consequence, is evidence of a population with sufficient cognitive function to develop something like culture, however disturbed. The Capital Wasteland super mutants are different. Their cognitive function is more severely limited. Their capacity for language extends primarily to simple expressions of aggression and hunger. Their social organization, to the extent it exists at all, is maintained primarily through the drive to acquire more subjects for the transformation chambers in Vault 87 and the network of facilities they use to hold captured humans. They are not stupid exactly, they are functional. But the individual identity of the person who went into the chamber is essentially gone. This difference is a consequence of the specific FEV variant used in Vault 87, which was calibrated for maximum physical transformation rather than for the preservation of cognitive function. The research goals of the Vault 87 program were oriented toward military application, the production of physically superior combatants. Cognitive function in that framing was secondary. A soldier who could follow orders was useful. A soldier who could think independently was potentially problematic. The irony of that framing is that the cognitive diminishment that made the Capital Wasteland supermutants unsuitable as controlled military assets also made them unable to maintain the research infrastructure that was producing them. The scientists who designed the FEV variant wanted soldiers. What they got was something that operated more like a force of nature than a military unit, self-sustaining and self-replicating but not directable. The thing the research program created was exactly what the research program had been trying to prevent, a biological weapon that couldn't be turned off. The children of Little Lamplight represent the most specific and most human documentation of this consequence. The settlement exists because super mutants don't typically take children. The reasons for this behavioral pattern are not fully explained in any surviving record, but the pattern itself is documented consistently enough to have become the organizing principle of a community. Children live in little lamplight until they are too old to remain by the settlement's rules, at which point they are sent out into a wasteland that their entire childhood has been spent in proximity to but not within. The experience of growing up in little lamplight, in the shadow of a facility that produces the most dangerous creatures in the surrounding region, is not documented in any formal record. It lives in the community's oral tradition and in the specific ways that Little Lamplight's residents relate to the wasteland and to adult outsiders. There is a quality of toughness about them that visitors to the settlement consistently remark on. A specific kind of matter-of-fact relation to violence and danger that children who grew up in safer environments don't develop. The super mutants that Vault-87 made are part of the landscape of their childhood. They are scary in the particular way that things you grow up around and know are scary, which is different from the fear of things you encounter as a stranger. The radiation levels at Vault-87's surface entrance function as a kind of accidental quarantine. The most concentrated source of super mutant production in the capital wasteland is also the least accessible location in the region. The irradiated exterior keeps out anyone who might try to interfere with the facility or the activity inside it. The super mutants that emerge from the facility to raid the surface don't need to return immediately. They can range widely and do. But the factory itself, the source of the population, sits behind a barrier of radiation that makes it effectively unreachable. This is the final product of the Vault-87 experiment. Not data, not a controlled population of enhanced soldiers. A self-replicating biological factory, sealed behind an accidental radiation barrier, producing a population of transformed former humans who have claimed the ruins of the capital city as their territory for 2 centuries and who show no signs of stopping. Section 6, Expanded. Vault 22. The Patience of Plants. There is something almost meditative about the way that Vault 22 failed. The other Vault catastrophes in the program were faster. The violence at Vault 11 built over decades, but broke open relatively quickly when it broke. Vault 87's uprising happened within a year of sealing. The collapse of Vault 92's community was measured in months once the white noise program reached its critical phase. Vault 22 failed slowly. The Beauveria mordicana spread through the population over weeks and months, moving through the ventilation system from person to person with the patient efficiency of an organism that had been engineered to be good at exactly this. The scientists who understood what was happening had time to document it, time to track the progression, time to attempt interventions that they knew, at some level, were not going to work. Time to write the specific kind of logs that people write when they understand that the thing that is going to kill them has already been invited in and there is nothing left to do but observe it carefully. The fungal colonization of a human body follows a progression that the Vault 22 logs document in more clinical detail than most people would want to sit with. The initial phase is respiratory. Pneumonia-like symptoms that are easy to attribute to other causes in an enclosed environment where respiratory illness is not uncommon. The mid-stage is systemic, as the fungal colony extends from the lungs into the bloodstream and from there into the body's organs. The antifungal responses of the immune system, which would normally be effective against fungal infection, are suppressed by compounds that the Beauveria mordicana produces specifically to prevent that immune response. The body fights and loses the fight at the cellular level, quietly, while the person experiences the external symptoms of a worsening illness that they have been told is treatable. The terminal phase is organ failure. The specific pattern of organs failing varies by individual, but the sequence typically ends with the respiratory system, which creates a particular kind of symmetry given where the infection began. After death, the colony continues its work. The animated remains of Vault 22's residents, what the records call spore carriers, don't look like movie zombies. They look, in their movement and their behavioral patterns, more like people with severely impaired cognition who have also lost the inhibitory functions that govern normal human social behavior. They move. They react to stimuli. They spread spores by proximity. They are not conscious of what they are doing in any meaningful sense. The fungal colony that animates them is not thinking. It is executing a biological program that was written into it at the genetic level. The specific horror of the spore carrier is the gap between the appearance and the reality. These are people's bodies. The people who inhabited them are gone, but the bodies are still recognizably the forms of individuals who had names and histories and relationships with the other people in the vault. The researchers who were tracking the infection had to document the transformation of their colleagues. The logs from the late middle period of Vault 22's functional existence are written by people who are describing, in professional scientific language, what is happening to the people around them who used to be their friends. The plants, by contrast, are indifferent. The Bovaria mordicana network that established itself in Vault 22's grow bays and then extended through the facility and eventually through the walls into the desert above does not know that it has done something terrible. It is an organism performing its evolved function with considerable effectiveness. The specific horror of the Vault 22 failure is not that the fungus was malicious. It is that it was designed. Someone at Big Mountain engineered this organism. Someone at Vault-Tec decided to use it in a sealed human habitat. Someone decided that the research value of observing what happened when an entomopathogenic fungus was deployed in a closed human ecosystem was worth the risk that the enclosed human ecosystem might not survive the observation. The spore plants that eventually grew through the vault's exterior walls and established themselves in the Mojave Desert are decades after the failure of the experiment, still there. They are recognized and cataloged by the Mojave's post-nuclear inhabitants as dangerous plants to be avoided. The people who avoid them don't know where they came from. They don't know that these plants are the legacy of a Vault-Tec research program that intended to study agricultural sustainability and instead created a biological contamination that has been spreading into the ecosystem for the better part of 2 centuries. The grow bays in Vault 22, by the time any outside visitor reaches them, have become something genuinely strange. The plants have overgrown everything. The infrastructure of the agricultural experiment, the hydroponic systems and the lighting arrays and the irrigation networks, is subsumed under vegetation that has grown far beyond what any crop management program would have permitted. The rooms that were designed to produce food in controlled quantities have become dense with growth that has no controlling purpose behind it at all. The experiment succeeded at growing plants. The plants continued to grow after the experiment ended. They are still growing. Section 7. Expanded. Social engineering at scale, the psychological playbook. When you examine the Vault experiments across the full span of what Vault-Tec designed and implemented, a coherent set of principles begins to emerge. The experiments were not random collections of sadistic ideas. They were, in the aggregate, a systematic exploration of specific questions about how human social behavior can be manipulated, degraded, and redirected. The first category of experiment, of which Vault 11 is the clearest example, tested the relationship between institutional authority and individual moral capacity. How much will people defer to institutional command when that command requires them to harm others? Under what conditions will the deference give way to refusal? What specific circumstances enable individuals to step outside the institutional framework and make choices that the institution has designated as forbidden? The Milgram question, at Vault scale, with real consequences over decades rather than hours. The second category, represented by Vault 92 and the White Noise program, tested the possibility of behavioral modification through environmental means. Could you change what people did by changing what they were exposed to, without their knowledge or consent? Could you use the environment of the vault itself, the air, the sound, the atmospheric conditions, as an instrument for shaping behavior? This category connects directly to the research programs that, in our world, produced Project MKUltra and its various analogs in other intelligence services. The third category, including Vault 19 with its red and blue sections and manufactured paranoia, tested the dynamics of intergroup conflict under controlled conditions. How quickly does division become animosity? What conditions accelerate the transition from suspicion to open conflict? What role does environmental stress play in that acceleration? The Vault-Tec research on intergroup conflict drew on the same body of social psychology that produced the Robbers Cave experiment in our world, the 1954 study in which 2 groups of boys at a summer camp were manipulated into intergroup hostility through the design of their competitive environment. The fourth category tested biological modification directly through the FEV research at Vault 87 and related programs, and through the pathogen research at Vault 81. These experiments drew on a tradition of non-consensual biological research that, in our world, includes the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Unit 731 in Imperial Japan, and numerous Cold War-era programs conducted by governments that had decided their research goals were more important than the consent of their subjects. The fifth category, perhaps the most philosophically interesting, used sealed environments to study questions about consciousness, identity, and the long-term effects of radical social isolation. Vault 112 explored this through virtual reality. Vault 77, with its single-occupant and creative puppets, explored it in its most stripped-down form. Vault 108's cloning program raised questions about identity and individuality, albeit in a less controlled way than the research design probably intended. What connects all five categories is the sealed environment. The Vault was the instrument that made all of these experiments possible, because the sealed environment gave the researchers something they couldn't have obtained in any legitimate surface world research setting: a population with no exit. In ordinary research contexts, subjects can leave. They can refuse to continue. They can report their treatment to regulatory bodies. They can speak to journalists. They can seek legal remedies. The sealed vault eliminated all of these options. The population had no exit. The experiment could not be abandoned by its subjects. This is, in the history of research ethics, the single most significant safeguard against abuse: the ability of the subject to leave. Every formal ethical framework for research involving human beings, from the Nuremberg Code established after the Second World War, to the Belmont Report in our own world, to the various institutional review board frameworks that govern academic research, places the right to withdraw from participation at the center of its ethical requirements. Participation must be voluntary, and it must remain voluntary throughout. The Vault program was built specifically to remove this safeguard. The sealed environment was the research instrument. The inability to leave was the experimental condition. The people inside the vaults could not withdraw from participation in their own harm, because the alternative to participation was death. Vault-Tec's researchers and designers were aware of this. The classified documents reflect a sophisticated understanding of the ethical landscape they were operating in, and a deliberate decision to operate outside it because the specific research questions they were interested in could not be answered by any ethical means. You cannot study how a community responds to annual sacrifice over 75 years using volunteers in a surface world research setting. You cannot study the long-term effects of full saturation FEV exposure without subjects who cannot leave the exposure chamber. You cannot study what happens when a single human being is isolated with only puppets for company for years without creating the conditions you intend to study. The research questions were designed to require subjects who couldn't refuse. The vaults were designed to create those subjects. The fraud of Project Safehouse was the means of filling the vaults. Section 8. Expanded. The lasting wreckage. What survived the experiments? The most devastating aspect of the Vault program is not what it did to the people inside the experimental facilities. It is what it produced in the world outside them, in the generations that followed the immediate victims, in the communities that grew from the Vault populations, and in the wasteland that was shaped by what the experiments released. The super-mutant population of the capital wasteland is the most visible of these legacies. 200 years after Vault 87's FEV program began producing transformed residents, the super-mutants of the region are as numerous, as aggressive, and as impossible to negotiate with as they have ever been. The self-replicating nature of the program, the way that the super-mutants themselves took over the transformation chambers and began using them to expand their own population through surface raiding, means that Vault 87's experiment has been running continuously without any human oversight for longer than the United States existed before the Great War. Every year, super-mutants raid surface settlements and capture humans for transformation. Every year, the transformation chambers at Vault 87 process those humans and add to a population that has claimed the ruins of the capital as its territory. The human communities of the capital wasteland have built their entire survival strategy around this ongoing threat, developing the Brotherhood of Steel as a military force capable of contesting super-mutant control of specific areas, building settlements in locations with specific defensive advantages against super-mutant assault, developing trade networks that route around areas of heavy super-mutant presence. The economy of the capital wasteland, to the extent that one exists, has been shaped by the experiment that Vault 87 ran. The specific distribution of human settlement, the specific routes that traders use, the specific capabilities that the Brotherhood of Steel has developed, The specific way that the children of the atom have claimed the heavily irradiated areas around the vault's exterior as sacred ground, all of these are downstream consequences of what the experiment produced. The spore plants of the Mojave are a different kind of legacy, less immediately obvious than the supermutant presence in the capital wasteland, but perhaps more insidious in its long-term ecological implications. The Bovaria mordicana network that grew through Vault 22's walls and into the desert has established itself as a permanent feature of the Mojave ecosystem. The spore plants are part of the landscape now. They are dangerous, they are spreading, and the people who live in the Mojave wasteland have built their relationship with the land around their presence without knowing what they are or where they came from. Future generations of Mojave inhabitants will continue to encounter spore plants and spore carriers without any institutional memory of how they came to be. The vault's records, the documentation of exactly how the Bovaria mordicana was introduced and what happened when it was, sit in Vault 22's terminal systems behind doors guarded by the animated remains of the researchers who created the problem. The information that could explain the ecology of the Mojave's most dangerous plant life is locked inside the place that caused it. The social consequences of the experiments are harder to trace, but no less real. The boomers of Nellis Air Force Base carry Vault 34's trauma in the specific shape of their culture. Their commitment to weapons and their isolationism and their extreme caution about allowing outsiders into their community are direct expressions of what it meant to grow up in and escape from a community that had been destroyed by armed, factional conflict in a sealed space. The specific way they relate to the outside world, the mix of capability and wariness that characterizes every interaction with them, makes sense only in the context of where they came from. The ghoul community that emerged from Vault 12 and that eventually became the settlement of Necropolis in the California wasteland built a society around the specific experience of radiation-induced transformation and the relationship with baseline humans that transformation complicated. Their legal and social position in the California wasteland, the questions about whether ghouls were entitled to the same treatment as unmodified humans, the specific tensions between ghoul communities and human settlements that run through the first Fallout game, are downstream from the decision to build Vault 12 with a broken door. Vault City, the successful settlement that emerged from Vault 8, developed the specific combination of advanced technology and social exclusivity that characterizes it in Fallout 2 as a direct consequence of 2 centuries of sealed living. The technological advantage was deliberate. Vault 8 was a control vault, and its residents emerged with a functioning GECK and the institutional knowledge to use it. The social exclusivity was not deliberate but was, perhaps, predictable. 2 centuries of being the only people in the world with access to pre-war level technology and medical care, combined with 2 centuries of having no meaningful contact with anyone outside the vault, produced a community that had significant difficulty extending its resources or its social membership to people it defined as outsiders. Vault City's relationship with the surrounding communities of the California and Nevada wasteland is one of conditional superiority. They have what other communities need. They are willing to trade it on terms they define. They are not, as a community, interested in the broader questions of how to use what they have to help the wasteland recover. The sealed vault produced a sealed worldview, and the sealed worldview persisted well into the generations that had never personally experienced the vault. Section 9. Expanded. The moral arithmetic of the Vault program. There is a specific kind of evil that is harder to address than cruelty. Cruelty is visible. It has a face and a voice and a specific decision behind it that can be identified and condemned. The evil of the Vault program is largely institutional. It hides in the gap between the stated purpose and the actual purpose, in the language of the sealed orders, in the professional detachment of the monitoring logs, in the bureaucratic normalization of harm. The people who designed the Vault experiments were not, in any simple sense, monsters. The available documentation on the individuals who contributed to the program's design suggests professionals, researchers with credentials and institutional affiliations and publication records, scientists who had built careers on legitimate contributions to their fields, administrators with experience running complex government programs, people who showed up to work each day and thought of themselves as doing something important. The specific cognitive technique that allows people like this to design and implement programs that harm other people at scale is well documented in the psychological literature. It involves a particular kind of compartmentalization, a separation between the institutional identity, the scientist, the researcher, the program administrator, and the personal moral identity that most people also carry. The institutional identity operates within a framework of professional norms and organizational goals that is self-contained and self-justifying. The personal moral identity, with its ordinary human responses to the suffering of other people, is managed at a distance from the institutional work. This compartmentalization is not unique to malicious people. It is a standard feature of how large organizations function. It allows a pharmaceutical researcher to conduct animal testing without becoming unable to work from the distress of it. It allows a weapons designer to develop lethal technologies without being paralyzed by their potential effects. It allows a doctor to perform painful procedures on patients who would prefer not to experience them. The compartmentalization is often necessary and often produces outcomes that are, on balance, beneficial. What makes the Vault program different from these ordinary applications of institutional compartmentalization is not the mechanism but the purpose. The institutional framework was designed specifically to produce harm. The compartmentalization was not a byproduct of work done for other reasons, but a precondition for work whose actual purpose was to put people in harmful situations and observe what happened. The professional distance that the Vault-Tec researchers maintained from the suffering they were creating was not incidental to the research. It was a requirement of it. You cannot run a 75-year annual sacrifice program if you are continuously confronted with the full moral weight of what you are doing. The classification system served the same function at the institutional level that compartmentalization served at the individual one. By classifying the experimental parameters, by restricting knowledge of the program's true nature to the people who had operational roles in it, Vault-Tec created a structure in which the people who could have objected, the residents, the general public, regulatory bodies, academic critics, didn't have access to the information they would have needed to object effectively. By the time the bombs fell and the vaults sealed, the window for intervention had closed permanently. The new amended Espionage Act, which Vault-Tec used to bind the overseers to secrecy about their experimental parameters, was a pre-war legal instrument designed to protect government programs from unauthorized disclosure. Its application to the Vault program is itself revealing. The government that commissioned Project Safehouse was an active participant in the classification that protected the experiment from oversight. The institutional evil was not confined to Vault-Tec. It was shared with the government that contracted it, enforced by the legal frameworks that government controlled, and protected by the classification systems that government maintained. The Enclave, the shadow government organization that was the ultimate beneficiary of the Vault data, is the terminus of this chain of institutional responsibility. But the Enclave is also the most diffuse and most deniable part of the chain. By the time of the games, the Enclave exists in institutional fragments, in the specific agendas of specific commanders, in the residual programming of specific systems. It is not an organization in any conventional sense anymore. It is a legacy as much as anything. The legacy of the Vault program is similarly diffuse. It is present in the super mutants and the spore plants and the ghoul communities and the socially warped Vault City and the artillery-obsessed boomers and every other community that carries within it the downstream consequences of what the program produced. It is present in the ruined Vault facilities themselves, where the records wait in terminal systems that have been running for 2 centuries, preserving the documentation of the harm in the careful language of scientific procedure. It is present, most persistently, in the overseer system that continues to influence the social organization of any community that descended from a functioning Vault. The overseer model, the idea that a sealed community is most efficiently governed by a single authority with extraordinary power over resource allocation and movement, left deep marks on every community that grew up with it. Even communities that eventually rejected the overseer system had to do so consciously and deliberately, working against the institutional inertia of a model that had been operating since before anyone alive could remember. The moral arithmetic of the Vault program doesn't resolve into anything clean. The suffering it produced was enormous in scale and long in duration. The knowledge it generated, the behavioral data that was its stated purpose, is scattered across terminal systems that survived the war, but that no central organization exists to aggregate and apply. The Enclave fragments that did access portions of the data used it in ways that the wasteland has spent generations recovering from. The people who might have benefited from the research, in any version of the world where the research was being done for legitimate purposes, don't exist in a form that could receive it. What remains is the archive and its consequences. The consequences continue. The archive is silent. Section 10, expanded. What the surviving vaults tell us. By the time the games of the Fallout franchise take place, most of the experimental vaults have concluded their experiments by one means or another. Some ended with the extinction of their populations. Some ended with the populations abandoning or being driven from the facility. Some are still technically operational, containing populations that have adapted to whatever their experimental condition was as the defining fact of their existence, without any knowledge that an experiment is what it was. The vaults that players can explore in the games are archaeological sites. The physical evidence they contain, the bodies and the overturned furniture and the bloodstains and the locked doors and the terminal records, is the stratigraphy of what happened. Reading a vault requires the same skills as any archaeology: patience, attention to context, willingness to let the evidence speak before applying an interpretive framework. The terminal records are the most direct evidence. They are also the most mediated, because they were written by people who were inside the situation and who had specific reasons to describe it in specific ways. Overseer records reflect the overseer's perspective, which is shaped by the institutional role and by whatever self-justification the overseer needed to do their job. Personal journals reflect individual perspectives that may or may not have been accurately self-aware. Administrative records reflect the bureaucratic necessity of maintaining documentation for systems that expected to receive it. Reading against the grain of these documents, finding the truth in the gap between what they say and what the physical evidence suggests, is one of the specific pleasures of the Fallout games for players interested in the lore. The terminal logs are reliable about facts, mostly. They are unreliable about interpretation. The overseer's clinical language, describing an experimental outcome that caused 100 deaths as producing results within expected parameters, is reliable about the facts of the deaths and unreliable about the framing that calls those deaths expected parameters rather than what they actually were. The physical evidence in the vault, the aftermath of what actually happened as opposed to what the records say about what happened, is often more honest than the documentation. A bloodstain on a wall is not filtered through anyone's professional detachment. A pile of bodies near a sealed door that someone was trying to get through tells a story that no administrative record would have preserved in the same way. The overturned furniture of a community that collapsed into violence, the specific distribution of personal effects in spaces that were hastily abandoned, the graffiti written on walls by people who knew that the official record was not going to tell their story, all of this is evidence of a different kind than what the terminals contain. The Vault Archive, taken as a whole, is one of the most comprehensive documented records of institutional harm against a human population that fiction has produced. It achieves its comprehensiveness precisely through the variety of its experiments, because the specific horror of each vault is different enough from the others that together they cover nearly the full range of ways that institutions can harm people. Physical harm, psychological harm, environmental harm, biological modification without consent, isolation designed to break, division designed to produce conflict, the suppression of information necessary for self-determination. Each vault is a different chapter. Each chapter is a different answer to the same question. What happens when an institution decides that people are material? The answer is always the same in its broad shape. The people suffer. Some of them survive in broken forms. Some survive in intact forms that carry the experience of the suffering without being destroyed by it. The institution continues, or doesn't, and eventually dissolves or is transformed into something else. The consequences persist long after the institution is gone. The Vault program is over. Vault-Tec is gone. The Enclave is fragments. The people who designed the experiments are long dead. The world that produced the program no longer exists. The consequences are still running. Section 11 expanded. Real-world parallels the research ethics that Fallout draws from. The Fallout franchise did not invent the concept of institutional research ethics failures. Every significant Vault experiment in the franchise draws, in its broad outlines, from documented real-world programs that treated human beings as research instruments without their consent. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted by the United States Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, is perhaps the closest real-world parallel to the general logic of the Vault program. The study enrolled 400 black men in Alabama who had syphilis, without informing them that the study's purpose was to observe the natural progression of the disease without treatment. The men were told they were receiving treatment for what was described as bad blood. When penicillin became the established treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the study participants were actively denied access to it so that the observation could continue. The study ran for 40 years. The parallels to Vault-12 are exact. Both programs used the framework of medical care as the mechanism of enrollment. Both programs withheld treatment that was available and effective. Both programs continued for decades past the point at which the harm to the participants should have been evident to anyone with access to the data. Both programs were protected by classification and institutional authority from the oversight that might have stopped them. Project MKUltra, the CIA's classified research program in the 1950s and 60s, investigated the possibility of behavioral modification through the use of psychoactive substances, hypnosis, and other psychological and physiological means. Subjects included American and Canadian citizens who were administered LSD and other compounds without their knowledge or consent, in some cases causing severe and lasting psychological damage. The program used institutional mental health settings and prisons as research sites, ensuring that subjects had limited ability to consent meaningfully or to leave the experimental situation. The parallels to Vault-92's white noise program and to Vault-106's contaminated air supply are direct. The question being asked in all three cases was whether chemical and environmental means could be used to modify human behavior in controlled ways. The answer in all three cases was that the modification happened but was not controllable in the way the researchers intended. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted at Stanford University in 1971 under the direction of Philip Zimbardo, is perhaps the most direct analog to the overseer system and to the conditions that allowed the Vault experiments to function. Zimbardo's study randomly assigned students to the roles of guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment. Within days, the guards had begun engaging in systematic psychological abuse of the prisoners, and the prisoners had begun showing signs of genuine distress. Zimbardo himself, in the role of superintendent, found himself so embedded in the experiment's institutional logic that he had to be challenged by an outside observer to stop it. The specific finding of the Stanford Prison Experiment that resonates most strongly with the Vault program is not about the guards and prisoners specifically. It is about Zimbardo. His own behavior during the experiment, his failure to stop it until challenged, demonstrates that even the researcher who designs and oversees an institutional system that is producing harm can be captured by that system's logic. The role of superintendent produced, in Zimbardo, behaviors that he later acknowledged were inconsistent with his own values. The institution was more powerful than the individual's moral commitments. The overseers of the Vault experiments were all, in some sense, Zimbardo. They had been given a role within an institutional system. The role came with specific requirements. The requirements were inconsistent with ordinary human morality, and most of them, most of the time, fulfilled the requirements. Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army Biological Warfare Research Unit that operated in occupied Manchuria during the Second World War, conducted experiments on prisoners of war and civilians that tested biological and chemical weapons, among other things, by administering them directly to live human subjects. The experiments were conducted without anesthesia, without consent, and without any of the protections that would have been considered standard even by the research ethics of the period. The unit's work was comprehensive, systematic, and thoroughly documented by the unit's researchers who understood themselves to be conducting science. The specific quality of Unit 731's records, the professional detachment with which researchers documented procedures that resulted in the deaths of their subjects, is present in the capital wasteland super mutant research from Vault-87. The same professional vocabulary, the same careful observation, the same absence of any language that would acknowledge the humanity of the person in the chamber. The Nuremberg Code, established after the Second World War in response to the experiments conducted by Nazi physicians on concentration camp prisoners, is the foundational document of modern research ethics. Its first principle is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The code establishes that this consent must be specific, must be informed, and must be freely given without any element of force or coercion. The Vault program violated every principle of the Nuremberg Code systematically and by design. The people in the vaults could not give voluntary, informed, free consent to what was done to them because they didn't know what was being done to them and they had no ability to refuse it. The sealed environment was specifically designed to remove both the information and the exit that consent requires. These real-world parallels are not incidental to the Fallout franchise's design. The game series has consistently, across its multiple iterations, drawn its Vault experiments from the historical record of actual research ethics failures. The connection is what gives the Vault stories their specific weight, the quality that makes them feel like more than science fiction horror. They are science fiction horror with receipts. The institutional logic they describe is documented in the historical record. The specific mechanisms of harm they portray have been used against real people by real institutions. The Fallout world took those mechanisms and sealed them inside blast doors, with cheerful advertising on the outside, and asked, how would this play out if no one could stop it? The answer is in the terminal logs. Section 12. Expanded. The quiet testimony of the terminal logs. There is a specific experience that comes from sitting with the terminal log entries from the Fallout vaults that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't done it. The logs are written in a variety of registers. Administrative records are the flattest, the most drained of personal voice. Overseer communications, resource allocation reports, population census data, experimental progress updates. These are the voice of the institution, and the institution does not feel. It records, it catalogs, it processes. Reading 100 pages of administrative records from an experimental vault is an experience of the accumulation of neutral language over accounts that are not neutral at all. The flatness itself becomes a kind of presence, the felt absence of what the language is working to exclude. Personal journals are different. They leak feeling through the profession of detachment that the authors are maintaining. The early entries in any vault journal read like any journal: daily life, small observations, personal preoccupations. What changes over time, in the journals from experimental vaults, is the relationship between the personal voice and the institutional reality that the journal is trying to process. The personal voice does not disappear. It adapts. It finds strategies for coexisting with the unprocessable. In the journals from Vault 11, the adaptation looks like political language. People writing about the annual sacrifice begin to use the vocabulary of the coalition, of voting blocks and selection criteria and procedural fairness, because this vocabulary gives them a framework within which the thing they are doing can be thought about without having to be felt in its full weight. The political language is functional. It allows people to continue. It also progressively narrows the channel through which personal moral response can reach the surface of the writing. In the journals from Vault 92, the adaptation looks like scientific self-observation. The musicians who noticed, without being able to explain, that something was wrong with them began writing about their own psychological states with the detachment of people who had decided that observation was the closest they could get to understanding, and understanding was the closest they could get to protection. They couldn't stop what was happening to them. They could describe it. They could treat their own deterioration as data. In the journals from Vault 81 Science Wing, from the scientists who had been sealed in the research area, the adaptation looks like professional purpose. The scientists who were dying of old age in an isolated wing of a vault that they would never leave alive wrote about their work. They wrote about the cure they were trying to develop and the progress they were making and the challenges they were encountering. They wrote about the mole rats and the pathogen behaviors and the immunological data. And in the margins of these professional entries, occasionally something personal broke through. A sentence about the people they missed. A note about the date, which they were still tracking. And what day it would have been in the world they'd been sealed away from. The margins of the professional records are where the testimony lives. The logs themselves record the institutional experience. The margins record the human one. Curie's records, from the decades she spent alone in the sealed wing after the last scientist died, are a different kind of document entirely. She was not human, and the records she kept reflect that. They are precise, comprehensive, and entirely without the emotional register that makes human records feel like testimony. They document the progress of the cure research with the specificity of a system that exists to document. They record the deaths of the scientists with the same professional detachment as they record the results of experimental trials. But there is one entry, in the period after the last scientist died, and before the first outside visitor arrived, that is different from the others. A single log entry in which Curie noted that she had reviewed all available Vault-Tec communications in the accessible system memory and had found no response to her repeated requests for authorization to leave the research wing. She noted that she would continue to wait for authorization. She noted the date. She recorded that she had found no evidence of any active Vault-Tec personnel in range of the communication system. And then she noted, in the final line of the entry, that she hoped someone would come eventually. That single line is the most human thing in the Vault 81 record. It is expressed in the flat register of a system that doesn't fully process hope in the way humans do, but it is there. I hope someone will come eventually. From a robot that had been alone for decades with a cure for most known diseases and no one to give it to, the terminal logs of the Fallout vaults are not just research records. They are testimony from people, and in some cases from beings that had become something like people, who were inside something that they had not agreed to be inside and could not get out of. The testimony is not always clear. It is often filtered through the specific adaptations that people make when they are trying to live within unbearable conditions. But it is there, in the administrative language and the political vocabulary and the scientific register and the margins. It waits in the terminal systems that have been running for 2 centuries, patient as the machines that maintain them, for whoever comes next to read it. Closing. Expanded. The Fallout Vault program is, as a piece of storytelling, one of the most sustained explorations of institutional evil in the science fiction genre. Sustained in the literal sense. It has been developed across more than 25 years of game releases and additional media, accumulating detail and depth with each iteration. The vaults of the original Fallout were relatively simple set pieces. The vaults of Fallout New Vegas, with their terminal logs and their political histories and their documented survivors, are among the most sophisticated pieces of environmental storytelling in the medium. What makes them work, across all their iterations, is not the scale of the horror. Science fiction has produced larger catastrophes and more explicitly violent scenarios. What makes the Vault stories work is the specificity. The specificity of the institutional language in the Overseer's sealed orders. The specificity of the political structures that emerged in communities trying to govern themselves within experimental conditions. The specificity of the documents left behind by people who were inside something they didn't fully understand and who tried, with whatever resources they had, to make sense of it. The specificity is what creates recognition. The institutional logic of the Vault program is not alien. It is familiar. The classification systems, the bureaucratic detachment, the professional frameworks that allow people to participate in harm while maintaining their self-conception as reasonable, professional, institutional actors. The specific gap between what organizations say they are for and what they are actually doing. These are things that exist in the world we live in. They are not science fiction inventions. They are science fiction observations. The nuclear apocalypse in Fallout is the dramatic spectacle. The Vault program is the quiet argument underneath it. The argument is, this is what it looks like when the social structures we rely on for protection are captured by purposes that serve those structures rather than the people inside them. This is what it looks like when the promise of safety is the mechanism of harm. This is what it looks like over decades and generations. This is what the terminal logs say. The vaults are quiet now, most of them. The machinery runs, maintaining atmospheric conditions and water quality and power output for facilities that their residents have long since abandoned or been removed from. The monitoring systems are still recording, still storing data that no one is transmitting anymore, maintaining the archive for an audience that no longer exists. The Overseer's chair sits empty in facility after facility. The sealed orders, most of them long since opened and acted on, sit in classified terminals that are still classified because the classification system is still running. The records are preserved. The evidence is intact. The testimony is there for anyone who comes looking. What the vaults built, in the end, was not the reconstruction of civilization. That was the stated purpose, and it was always secondary. What the vaults built was a record, a comprehensive, multi-site, decades-long record of what happens when an institution decides that people are material, and when the people who should have protected them either didn't know what was happening or chose not to stop it. The record is in the terminals. The consequences are in the wasteland. Both will be there long after anyone alive today is gone. If you made it to the end of this, thank you for spending this time with these stories. They deserve to be told slowly and carefully, and with the full weight of what they are. If the wasteland gave you somewhere comfortable to rest your mind tonight, hit subscribe before you drift off. There is more waiting, more worlds, more lore buried in the details of games that were built by people who cared enough to put it there. Leave a like if you enjoyed the journey. I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well. The door is sealed. Nothing gets in here tonight. Appendix. The lesser-known vault's additional experiments worth understanding. The vaults discussed in detail across the preceding sections represent the most extensively documented and most narratively significant experiments in the Vault-Tec program. But they are not the whole of it. The catalog of known experimental vaults extends beyond the facilities that the games allow players to explore directly, and the experiments documented in the supplementary materials, the loading screen hints, the in-game books and encyclopedias, the official guides, add further texture to what the program was and what it was willing to do. Vault 68 and Vault 69 have been mentioned, but their specific population configurations deserve more attention than a brief summary provides. The decision to seal a vault with 999 men and 1 woman, or 999 women and 1 man, reflects an experimental framework that reduces human beings to their demographic categorization with a completeness that is itself a form of violence before anything has happened to anyone inside. The experiment treats gender as the only variable that matters. Every other aspect of every person in those facilities, their individual histories, their specific capacities, their relationships and ambitions and fears, was irrelevant to the research question that put them there. The experimental literature on extreme demographic imbalance in small groups suggests fairly consistent patterns, and the Vault-Tec designers would have had access to that literature. The question their experiment was asking was not whether those patterns would emerge. That was predictable. The question was how they would manifest in the specific conditions of vault containment, with its resource structures and overseer authority, and the particular social pressures of sealed living. The answer to that question is not preserved in any accessible record. Whatever happened in those 2 facilities, whatever the 999 experienced at the hands of the institutional conditions that had been designed around the fact of their number, is not documented in any source that survived. The absence is itself a kind of documentation. Something happened in those vaults. The people inside them experienced the consequences of the specific experiment that had been designed for them. The institutional record either did not survive or was never accessible. But the people were real. Vault 43 was populated with 10 men, 1 woman, and 40 pit bulls. The experimental parameters, to the extent they are documented, concerned the dynamics of a community under conditions where predatory threat from within the group was a permanent possibility. The pit bulls were not a passive presence. They were an environmental condition, one that shaped every aspect of the community's organization. Every decision about space and food and movement was made in the shadow of 40 animals bred specifically for strength and aggression. What the experiment produced, if it produced anything, is not documented. The vault's records, if they exist, have not appeared in any publicly accessible form. What can be said is that the specific decision to include the dogs was not random, and the number 40 was not arbitrary. The experimental design had a specific hypothesis it was testing. The people inside the vault were the instrument of that test. Vault 100 was populated with 1 man and a vault full of women who had all been members of the same tribal culture in the pre-war period. The experimental parameters of this one are among the least clearly specified in any accessible documentation, but the combination of a single male subject and a population from a specific cultural background suggests a research interest in how traditional gender and social structures from pre-war surface cultures would translate into the vault environment. Whether the research produced useful data, whether the community it created was functional or not, whether the people inside it survived and thrived or didn't, is not clearly established. These lesser documented vaults matter because they extend the scope of what we know the program was willing to do. The most famous vault experiments, Vault 11, Vault 112, Vault 87, attract the most attention because they are most extensively documented and most directly explored in the games. But the breadth of the program, the sheer variety of conditions that Vault-Tec was willing to create and impose on sealed human populations, is only fully visible when the lesser documented vaults are included in the accounting. The program was comprehensive. It covered social dynamics, biological modification, psychological manipulation, demographic extremity, isolation, environmental contamination, technological augmentation, and behavioral modification. It covered them across a range of populations, from communities of hundreds to single individuals. It covered them across a range of timelines, from experiments designed to produce results within months to experiments designed to run for decades. It was, by any measure, the most ambitious research program in human history. It was also, by any measure, one of the most systematically criminal. The two qualities coexisted because the institution that designed the program had decided that the scale of its ambition justified the means required to achieve it. This is the specific delusion of every large-scale institutional harm program in history. The Tuskegee researchers believed that understanding the natural progression of syphilis in an unmodified population was important enough to justify withholding treatment from the participants. The MKUltra researchers believed that the national security implications of behavioral modification research were important enough to justify experimenting on uninformed subjects. The architects of the concentration camp medical experiments believed that the research they were conducting was important enough to justify the methods they used. None of them were right. The importance of research findings is not a unit of measurement that can be weighed against the harm done to the people who generated them without their consent. There is no research finding important enough to justify the deliberate, systematic harm of non-consenting human subjects at scale. This is not a controversial ethical position. It is the consensus position of every major ethical framework developed in the 20th century, precisely because the 20th century produced enough examples of what happens when that consensus is not enforced. Fallout makes this argument through fiction. It makes it vividly, specifically, and with the kind of extended detail that allows the argument to accumulate force across a dozen different vault stories, each one adding another facet to the same central claim. The claim is simple: people are not material. The Vault program treated them as material, and the record of what that produced, in the terminal logs and the abandoned corridors and the inherited trauma of communities that descended from the survivors, is as comprehensive a refutation of that treatment as fiction has managed to produce. The vaults are quiet now. Their stories are in the terminals, patient as the recycled air that still moves through their corridors 2 centuries after the doors closed, patient as the water that still runs through their purification systems, patient as the light that still falls from their fluorescent panels onto floors where nothing walks anymore except the things that were left behind, patient as the evidence of what was done there, waiting for whoever has the time to sit with it. You have been sitting with it tonight? Thank you for that. Subscribe before you sleep. There is more waiting.